Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is story about what if Konoha begs Naruto for forgiveness part 1. Before I start, please do support for more amazing content and comments for part 2. Do consider to subscribe my channel and share my video to your friends and check out the description as well. Let's start the video. Kakashi's POV. Are you alright with Kakashi team? You look like you've seen a ghost. The smirk directed at him was so uncharacteristic on his former teammate's face that Kakashi immediately opened his mouth to attempt to deny the man's identity. He wasn't given a chance as the man thrust his palm into Kakashi's chest and threw Kakashi off his feet. The two were in the middle of the fallen Konoha. It had been destroyed after 3 days of non-stop fighting between Konoha and few of their allies against the remaining members of the Akatsuki. Kakashi was one of the few left alive, and the last one that could still fight, having left the village a couple of weeks before in an attempt to recruit more villages to help them. He had been one of the few available at the time, otherwise he never would have left. Usually they would send a messenger of lower rank and ability since they needed the stronger ninja to help fight. But with all of the fighting outside of the village, they were afraid that a lower-ranked messenger wouldn't survive long enough to reach the other villages. Besides, as far as their intel showed, Konoha wouldn't be attacked for another month at least. As soon as he'd heard of the Akatsuki nearing Konoha after just a short week and a half, he'd started to race back, having nothing to show for his efforts. The other villages he'd visited had either already fallen, or didn't have any ninja to spare as they too sought to protect their homes. When he'd returned to Konoha, he'd been too late. Most of the Akatsuki had fallen, but so had Konoha. He had been cautiously looking around the village, searching for any survivors so that they could escape to somewhere safer, when he'd run into the orange-masked ninja. At first he had assumed the man was Uchiha Madara, as all of their intel had pointed towards. It wasn't impossible. The man had such a reputation that even though he should have died by now, there was a huge possibility that he could have stayed alive through one technique or another. Only after Kakashi had broken the mask, when the man had been distracted by Kakashi's ninken, did Kakashi see who had really been the cause of all the destruction and the war that had gone on for the past several years. Despite the damage to his face, the right half showing the extensive scarring from when Obito had been crushed and the Rinnegan in his right eye, there was no mistaking him for anyone other than his former teammate, and any denial was just wishful thinking on his part. He couldn't believe Obito could have done something like this, but really didn't have much time to think past that, as he was still in a lot of danger. Kakashi was injured pretty heavily, and while he'd been able to remove the orange-swirled mask, that was pretty much all he'd accomplished in his attacks. The other man wasn't even sweating, and his breathing showed that he wasn't taxing himself in the least as he fought. It was unlikely that this had been due to a large gap in their skills though. Kakashi hadn't slept in several days, and had run out of food before that. He'd also increased his speed using chakra, and hadn't been at his full capacity when he'd stumbled upon Obito. The two fighters were currently at the point where the marketplace met the civilian district, and most of the houses in the area had been decimated. Wood from the houses, broken up furniture, and bodies littered the streets around them. The air carried the distinct scent of burning hair and flesh. Kakashi winced as Obito's strike to his chest broke a couple of his ribs, and he then landed hard on his back in a pile of broken up wood. He felt a few pieces puncture his clothing, and then enter his body painfully. He cried out and tried to rise, but before he could get himself to a better stance, the man's foot was on his chest, keeping him pinned to the ground. The pain from his ribs kept him from moving, and he marveled at the fact that his lungs hadn't been punctured yet. Before he could react, his cloth mask was torn from his face. That's it. I was expecting you were either extremely ugly or extremely attractive, with the way you refused to show your face. The man shook his head in mock disappointment, before he shrugged and threw the mask aside, kunai moving to Kakashi's throat. No matter, I'd like an apology from you now. I know it won't matter much in the long run, nothing will change and I'll still kill you, but at least let me hear it from you, Kakashi team, he requested, pressing down with the weapon and drawing blood from the copy nin's throat. Obito, he coughed out. Yes, I suppose that was my name, though it doesn't matter much anymore. I'm surprised that you picked now of all times to speak unnecessarily. All I want is an apology, he mused, smirking at his fallen former teammate. Kakashi coughed a bit more and Obito pulled back the weapon just a bit to allow him to speak, probably so that he wouldn't accidentally kill him before getting his response. From his earlier tone, it was likely that he also wanted to continue to play with Kakashi some more before killing him. I'm sorry that I couldn't save you, and that I left you behind. I'm so dash. The weapon pressed down harder than before and Obito's face morphed into a snarl of rage, his mismatched eyes flashing angrily. Kakashi gave a strangled cough beneath him. You think this is about me? You think I'm doing all of this because of some revenge for something you had no control over? I never blamed you for that. What I cannot forgive is you letting her die, he growled, pulling back the kunai and striking Kakashi's temple with the butt of the weapon. Kakashi's vision spotted at the blow, and he fought to stay conscious. Who? Kakashi asked dazedly as he tried to stay focused on the situation at hand. Who? Who? Obito shouted, shifting and stomping on Kakashi's right hand. They both heard the crunch as several of his bones broke and he bit back a cry. A weak whimper still escaped. Obito removed his foot and dropped down, placing his left knee on Kakashi's chest, along with a great deal of weight. Kakashi exhaled sharply at the pain caused by his broken ribs and his numerous other injuries. Try as he might, he could not draw in a breath, and he doubted his lungs were still intact. That didn't matter much, he would die relatively quickly after Obito had finished whatever he had planned. Kakashi couldn't hope to put up any sort of fight against him anymore. Our teammate. You promised me you'd protect her. You should have died in her place. Without Rin this world should not exist. He growled and then threw himself backwards off of Kakashi, who tried to catch his breath. You know what, you bastard, you get to be in the center of my greatest achievement. Witness the end of this hell. Obito's Sharingan sprang to life in the Manjikyu form, and he started through his hand seals. Kakashi frowned, pushing himself up as much as he dared with his injuries, struggling with the nearly impossible task. His lungs weren't working properly, but he figured they hadn't been punctured since he hadn't drowned in his own blood yet. Finally he gave up on his futile struggle and focused on the Uchiha. Obito, stop. You can't do this. Rin's alive, he cried. His voice was extremely forced, as it became more and more difficult to draw a breath. He slowly allowed himself to fall back, trying to relieve the pressure on his body as much as he could to prolong his life long enough to give Obito the truth. Obito glared at him. You'd even lie about Rin's memory to save yourself. That's pathetic, he spat at the copy nin in anger. Kakashi shook his head. No, you don't understand. That's not the full story. Sensei and I faked Rin's death to protect her. She was in danger. Your clan figured out that she was the one who transplanted your eye. They thought that she'd learned the secret of your bloodline. They wanted her dead. She's been living in vegetable ever since. She sent me a letter just a couple of months ago, he explained hurriedly through gasps as he tried to breathe inward, only succeeding in expelling more oxygen. He figured he would die in another minute. Obito's POV. Obito slowed in his hand seals after Kakashi's explanation, staring at the silver-haired nin. Faked her death? Rin was still alive. That seemed too good to be true. Then the rest of the words hit him. She had been in vegetable? You excuse me? He asked shakily, wishing that he hadn't sounded so uncertain. He was unsure if he wanted to hear this or not. If Kakashi was telling the truth, well, he wasn't sure that he could live with the implications. Kakashi nodded from where he lay on the ground, looking at Obito cautiously. She's still alive, he gasped out, and she's just fine. She runs the hose with a dash. He abruptly stopped speaking, beginning to cough. No. You're lying. You have to be. Obito had stopped forming seals and was staring at Kakashi in horror. It couldn't be true. If it was, then what had he done? Kakashi shook his head weakly in disagreement with Obito's words, but didn't say anything more. Seeing his old teammate was starting to fade out of consciousness, Obito moved to Kakashi's side, starting to heal the man's lungs and ribs enough for him to be able to breathe. He needed to know what Kakashi was talking about, if he was telling the truth or just lying to him. While he hoped that he was being lied to, he couldn't shake the feeling that Kakashi was being completely truthful. She sent me a picture. She's adopted several children there. She looks almost like she did when she left, a bit older of course, and she grew out her hair. She had to dye it when she went into hiding, and she picked black in memory of you. Obito didn't hear the rest of Kakashi's tired and gasping explanation. The woman that ran the hospital? Black hair? The marks on her face had matched Rin's, and he'd ordered her death because she had reminded him so much of her that it had been painful. She had been alive this entire time? Kakashi hadn't broken his promise? Obito had been the one that had killed her? No, 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 no. He screamed, gripping his hands. This wasn't how things were supposed to turn out. He was supposed to complete the technique, go back in time, and make sure that Rin survived. He would then destroy Kakashi, let everyone know what kind of person he was, how he only cared about himself. Only, with this information he had not only misjudged his teammate, but he was completely at fault. Kakashi hadn't broken his promise. He had done everything he could to take care of Rin. Obito? Kakashi's weak voice broke him out of his shock. You have to be lying. She died and she wasn't in vegetable. Tell me she wasn't in vegetable, Obito ordered, tears pouring down his face as he knew that it was the truth. She was. I don't understand what's dash. Obito cut him off with a pain-filled cry, beginning to attack everything in sight. Kakashi once again broke him from his tantrum. What exactly is going on? Kakashi asked hesitantly, flinching when Obito turned to him, and Obito was dimly aware of his Sharingan still being activated. I killed her, Obito said, voice full of self-loathing. Vegetable fell 3 weeks ago. I ordered everyone dead, man, woman, and child. I confirmed the deaths myself, he explained hollowly. He didn't want to admit to it, not even to himself, but after what he'd just learned, he owed Kakashi that much at least. Kakashi's eyes widened in disbelief and his voice shook when he spoke. Rin? Please tell me you didn't. She was all I had left. Obito's opinion of himself dropped much lower when he heard the agony in the man's voice. You how? Why? Kakashi asked dazedly, looking up at him with a lost expression, no fear in his eyes as he met the Manjikyu Sharingan, when he had avidly avoided it before now. Obito flinched back at the expression Kakashi wore. It was completely defeated and broken. He had accomplished part of his goal, but celebrating was the furthest thing from his mind. He had done all of this to avenge Rin, A woman who wasn't even dead. And to make matters worse, he had blamed and taken it out on Kakashi, who was protecting her. It looked as though she meant as much to him as she did to Obito. You killed Rin, and you caused Sensei's death. Naruto too. You killed Sensei's son, Kushin and Achan, Pakken, Bull, Urishi. His voice dropped as he continued to mutter the names of his ninken that Obito had personally killed in the past hour of fighting. He made sure that it was brutal, tearing most of them to pieces, and crushing the others, forcing yelps and howls of pain from each one of them before they died. In the past he'd imagined how pitiful Kakashi's voice would be as he pleaded for his life. But even though the tone was so much more pathetic than he'd ever expected from his former rival, he couldn't take any pleasure in it. It actually made him sick now, especially knowing that he was the cause of it. The last member of his old team, as of 3 weeks ago, he thought grimly, was falling apart right in front of him, and it was all his fault. He was pulled out of his thoughts when he felt Kakashi grab his arm. He flinched in surprise at the touch. Kakashi had been quite a ways away when he'd started to tune him out, and despite his healing him, Kakashi should have been in too much pain to move. He didn't push Kakashi away. As it was, Kakashi was probably going to kill him, and to be honest, he deserved much more than just death for what he'd done. He wasn't expecting what came next as he felt the hilt of a kunai slide into his hand. You said that you would kill me, didn't you? Please, just please finish it. I know I don't deserve it, but I want to see Sensei and Rin again, and it'll make you feel better, right? Kakashi asked in a small, shaky voice, and Obito nearly fell apart as well at how Kakashi begged for death. Kakashi's hold weakened less than a minute later, and he collapsed to the ground. Obito crouched down, thinking that he'd finally passed out from his injuries, but that wasn't the case. Kakashi was still conscious, but both of his eyes were glazed over, he was shaking horribly, and his breath was coming in gasping sobs. Kakashi, Obito called, waving his hand in front of the man's face, and then pinching him to try and get his attention. Nothing worked, and Obito sat back to observe him, completely at a loss as to what he should do. He had been so focused on revenge that turned out to be needless. He had gotten it, he had destroyed the man he'd wanted revenge on, and now that he'd done it, he would do anything to undo it. Reaching out, he started to heal the man's injuries further, having learned a great deal of medical ninjutsu. It was necessary to transplant new eyes after all. The next several days were hell for him, and he definitely deserved it. Kakashi had finally passed out, and when he'd regained consciousness, he had definitely not been any Kakashi that Obito had ever known. Obito had only wanted a reaction from him when he'd awakened, and what he'd gotten had made him feel worse than trash. When Kakashi had woken up, he had looked at Obito uncertainly for several minutes before he'd reached out for him. Obito, you're alive, Kakashi had said in wonder, reaching out to him hesitantly, almost as if he thought this was a dream, and Obito might not actually be there. Obito didn't pull back as Kakashi touched his face, and he had been unprepared for the silver-haired man to lunge forward, hugging him tightly. I'm so glad. It was my fault, it should have been me in that rock slide. Rin and Sensei were so upset. I know they both blamed me. I wasn't supposed to wake up, but I'm glad I did so that I can apologize, he babbled into Obito's neck. The relief in his voice made Obito blink back tears, but he tried to focus on what the man was telling him. You weren't supposed to wake up? Obito asked in confusion. He felt Kakashi nod and the man pulled back, wiping the tears from his eyes. I got you killed. Did you know that my dad failed a mission to save his teammates? I dishonored his memory, so I tried to repent, he explained. Obito's breath caught in his throat. Kakashi had tried to kill himself? He hadn't expected his death to have affected his former teammate that much. Sure, his past interactions with the man when he went by Toby had shown the man was a lot different than how he had been when they were teammates, but he thought that it had been Minato's death that had affected him, not his supposed one. But it looks like I survived. Did Rin heal me? Kakashi continued, unaware of Obito's inner turmoil as he looked around for the girl. No, Obito's words died in his throat. Kakashi obviously wasn't in his right mind, and he couldn't bear to break the news to the man all over again, even though he knew that Kakashi deserved to know everything that was going on at this moment, and so much more. What happened? The silver-haired nin was looking at him in confusion now, obviously meaning the destruction around them. Obito observed him silently. He was a bit confused as to how Kakashi hadn't noticed he was a lot older than he should have been, that Obito was now 30 instead of the younger age that Kakashi's memory seemed to be sending him to, also that Obito had 2 eyes, one of them very different, instead of the one that he should have had after the accident. Are you alright, Obito? He flinched as Kakashi looked at him worriedly. Stop looking at me like that, you should be cursing me, or trying to kill me, Obito thought in agony. He had been the cause of all of Kakashi's pain in the past 13 years after all, starting with the death of their sensei. Hell, probably before that since he hadn't returned to Konoha after he'd started to recover. I'm sorry, Obito. Kakashi's voice broke him out of his thoughts once more and Obito swallowed hard as bile started to rise in his throat. Since you're alive, that means that we left you there all alone. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I just want you to know how sorry I am, Kakashi continued sincerely, not noticing the effect it was having on his former teammate. Obito humored the teen trapped in the man's body for the next 3 days the best he could. He had worked up the courage to explain what had happened to Kakashi on the second day, But Kakashi hadn't been interested at the time, and the news of Minato's and Rin's deaths hadn't seemed to register with him. The silver-haired nin's thoughts were all over the place. One minute he was talking to Obito about the things that happened in the days following his death. Then he would jump to begging for forgiveness as if he hadn't already done so many times before, and then he would ask about Rin and Minato again. The thoughts never stayed with him for long though, and he never remembered the conversations from the days prior. Obito had had to repeat himself several times, but it was the least he could do for the man. Obito also got Kakashi to eat. The copycat hadn't even thought about such things, and Obito had had to agree to eat as well before Kakashi would do so. Obito wasn't able to keep anything down though, making sure Kakashi was safe before heading off to throw up whatever he'd just eaten. "Stop," Obito muttered on the third day when Kakashi was once again kneeling in front of him in apology. He couldn't take this anymore. Kakashi looked up at him in confusion, having heard something, but not sure exactly what had been said. "Just stop it, Kakashi, I can't take this." He felt tears start to pour down his face and grabbed Kakashi's torn collar, dragging the man close to him, Sharingan activating. It only took a few moments for him to break the barrier to Kakashi's memories. He released him, allowing Kakashi to fall back. Now that Kakashi was back to normal, he waited for the anger to come. His stomach dropped even further as Kakashi knelt in front of him again. "I meant what I said. I'm sorry for leaving you alone there, and for everything that you've gone through." Thinking Rin was dead for so long, he apologized sincerely. Kakashi's POV. There was nothing left for Kakashi, and while he hadn't been fully aware just moments before, that didn't mean he didn't understand what was going on. He had been blaming himself enough for everything for so long, but apparently he hadn't taken enough blame. He now knew what had caused everything, and he felt guiltier than he had previously. Not listening to Obito had caused him to be alone for who knows how long, crushed under the rocks. Not being able to defend Rin better had forced her into hiding. Not offering to finish the seal and offer up his soul in place of his sensei's had led to Minato's death, and Naruto being orphaned. Not being invegetable when the Akatsuki had attacked had led to Rin's death. Everything could be traced back to the day that Obito had been abandoned. His fault. "Kakashi." Obito's voice wavered as the man got his attention. Kakashi looked up at him to see that the Uchiha was wiping tears away. "This entire time, I wanted revenge on you, even though you didn't deserve it." Kakashi opened his mouth to argue, but Obito held up his hand to silence him. "You did nothing to warrant my revenge, and I took everything from you. This crusade I've been on, I wanted to destroy the world, this world without Rin in it, and all I accomplished was the death of thousands and actually killing the one person I wanted to avenge," he said with a self-deprecating smile. He shifted and dropped down to Kakashi's level. "I found a technique, one that requires a lot of sacrifices to work. I was going to use you as my final sacrifice, complete my revenge, but now I realize that I don't deserve this," he told him with a shake of his head. Kakashi froze as Obito activated his Sharingan, and it shifted into the Manjiki state. "It basically would give me a second chance, and I plan to destroy your younger self, and keep Rin safe," he explained. Kakashi nodded. "I understand, you have every right dash." He was cut off by Obito shaking his head. "I don't deserve it, you." However, Kakashi tried to move as Obito started to make his hand seals, with no success. He was frozen in place by Obito's Sharingan, and couldn't do anything, not even speak. "This won't make up for anything, since you'll still have all your memories and all of the pain from before, and I'll understand if you kill my younger self to protect everyone. Just, please try and be happy," he requested. Time seemed to stand still for him as Obito brought up a kunai and stabbed it through his own heart, creating the last hand seal with one hand as he did so. "Goodbye, and I'm sorry," Obito told him as he died. Kakashi didn't have any time to react before the area around them lit up in a blinding white, and he felt himself fall into darkness. Kakashi's POV. When Kakashi first woke, he took a few moments to regain his bearings. He was in his home, the one that he'd lived in until just after Obito's death, having inherited it from his father. It had been given to him the moment he'd achieved the rank of genin. Before that he'd lived with Minato, as he had been considered much too young to be by himself. The man had volunteered to look after him, having been friends with his father, Tsukumo, despite the age difference between them. Minato had fiercely protested when Kakashi had requested to move back here. Even if he had reached the rank of genin, he had only just turned 5 years old. Kakashi had insisted that he didn't need to rely on Minato for help. He had attained the rank of genin of Konoha, and was therefore an adult by law. The first thought that popped into his head when he began to look around was that he had been dreaming, that Konoha was still standing and that he could go meet his former students for lunch, or some sparring, maybe wait for Guy to challenge him to a ridiculous contest of some sort. That was just wishful thinking though, and he knew it. A couple of months after Obito had supposedly died, Kakashi had moved out of the Hataki home, and into an apartment. The amount of space available in the house had made him start to feel lonely, and he'd had to leave. The house was a 3-story, with 6 bedrooms. There was a kitchen, living room, a bathroom and dining room on the main floor, along with 3 of the rooms. The second floor had the other 3 bedrooms, and another bathroom. The third floor was more of an attic. Tsukumo had once lived here with his parents, aunt, and cousin. After the last of them had died, and his mother had as well, Tsukumo had converted one room into a study for himself, one into a library, one into storage, one into a guest room, one into Kakashi's room, and one as his own room. Up until the time he'd moved out, Kakashi had stayed away from his father's room and the study, not sure if he'd be able to handle entering them when they would hold so many memories of his father. He didn't leave the house though, even if it hurt, because that would be proving people right, that he was too young to be on his own. He had also needed to show that he could follow the shinobi code by dampening his emotions. Reality came crashing down on him still further, when he'd risen from his bed and nearly tripped, his limbs much smaller than he remembered them being, causing him to misjudge his movements. His dread continued to increase as he walked hesitantly to the mirror, letting out a pained cry when he confirmed that all of this was really happening to him. He hadn't noticed it right when he'd woken up, used to just keeping his Sharingan eye closed because it ate up his chakra, but there was no scar present. He cautiously opened his left eye to see that the Sharingan he'd had for so long was gone. Trying not to panic, he focused on discerning his age, and guessed that he was probably around 8 or 9. He was generally pretty good with guessing ages of people, at least when they weren't using strange techniques to alter their appearance. Racing back to his bed, he dug under it until he found his team picture, confirming that he was at least 9 since that had been when Obito and Rin had been added to his team. He hadn't cared for this picture at all when he was younger, mainly because he didn't want the two on his team. He had smashed the frame to pieces after he'd brought it home before kicking it under his bed. When Obito had supposedly died, he had pulled it out, getting it a new frame and leaving it in the middle of his kitchen table. He'd found it quite pathetic, but it was another way for him to keep his teammates' memory alive, to act as though Obito were eating with him. As he looked down at the picture, he wiped away a tear. He was really in the past. He could make it up to Obito now. In an attempt to cheer himself up, he joked, "I can't blame the tears on Obito being a crybaby now." That only served to upset him further, and he tried to stifle a cry, which failed as he began to sob uncontrollably. He winced as he dropped the picture, cutting himself on some of the broken plastic cover as it fell. Ignoring that, he moved forward and collapsed onto his bed, crying into his pillow. Pakin's POV. Pakin frowned when he woke up around 7 in the morning, to find his bowl, which was usually filled in the mornings, empty. The pug glared accusingly at Urishi and Yuhei. Urishi, the light brown dog with the white underbelly and muzzle, along with spiky fur on his head, looked at him in confusion, glancing at the bowl as well. Yuhei, the red-brown pup with the white underbelly and muzzle, wasn't so calm about it and barked, upset at the accusation, and Pakin expected, due to hunger as well. Kakashi was usually gone by now, out training. He had never forgotten to feed the two ninken and ninken in training though, and Pakin doubted that the boy would ever be so irresponsible. Sure, they could get their own food, but it took a lot of maneuvering to do so and generally ended up creating a big mess for Kakashi to clean up later on. Both Pakin and Urishi had passed their ninken tests. Pakin 2 years before, and Urishi a few months ago. Yuhei was coming along with his training, and would hopefully be taking his test in another few months, if Kakashi wasn't too preoccupied with their newest additions. Minato had stopped by a few weeks ago while Kakashi was in the middle of one of his D-ranked missions to speak with the 3 dogs, and had asked if they would be upset if Kakashi received 2 more dogs. They hadn't been that surprised. Pakin had been a gift to Kakashi after his father's death, something to keep his mind occupied from the grief. Kakashi had trained him some, but had been more focused on passing the academy. It had been when Kakashi was about to turn 8 that Pakin had taken, and passed, the ninken test. Urishi had been given to Kakashi on his 8th birthday by Minato. Yuhei had been given to him on his 9th birthday, again, by his teacher. Minato had come both times to ask Pakin, and then Urishi as well the year after, if he would be alright with more dogs, and the ninken had readily agreed. They knew that Kakashi would want them, and thought that having some more company would be nice for when Kakashi wasn't home. Kakashi's 10th birthday was in a month, and Minato wanted to give him 2 dogs this time since Kakashi had developed a pretty good training system from working with the 3 he already had. Pakin also figured it was sort of an apology for accepting the 2 genin onto the team, even though that was how things were supposed to be done. "Pakin, you here?" Urishi asked in broken speech, snapping him from his thought. Urishi was almost 2 years old and had gotten down the basics of spoken words, and was now learning the proper grammar. "Cry," Yuhei yipped in agreement. Yuhei was the newest addition, having been there just under a year. He was a lot more excitable than the other 2 since he was so young. He had started speaking earlier than Pakin and Urishi with help from Kakashi and the 2 ninken. He didn't have a very large vocabulary yet, and wasn't very good at putting words together into sentences. Pakin's ears perked up, and sure enough he too heard the sound of crying. Alarmed, he raced out of the kitchen and down the short hallway, past the first bathroom, and to the room where Kakashi slept. He pushed it open with his paw hesitantly. Kakashi never closed the door in case one of the ninken wanted to sleep in his room. Pakin was nearly bowled over by Urishi and Yuhei, who weren't as concerned with Kakashi's privacy. Both of them raced into the room and then jumped onto Kakashi's bed, whimpering, "What's wrong, pup?" Pakin padded silently into the room behind them. Kakashi flinched at the sound and pushed himself up, wiping his eyes on the back of his hand. "Sorry," Kakashi mumbled, allowing Yuhei to lick his face. Pakin jumped up onto the bed next to him. "Did you have a nightmare, pup?" he asked. Kakashi had many nightmares, but he usually hid them from everyone expertly. When Kakashi had been younger, Pakin had slept on the floor nearby in his room because more often than not Kakashi would need to be woken up from one. If he slept on the bed, he had been liable to get thrown off. They weren't as frequent now though, and Kakashi refused to allow anyone to see how much they upset him. When Kakashi had been little, most of the dreams had been about his father's death, and he would cry for a long time after having one. He didn't cry anymore though. He'd stopped crying around the age of 6 when he'd reached Chunin, rigidly trying to follow the shinobi rule about ninja not showing tears. Even before that, he'd attempted to dampen his emotions to a degree that had worried a lot of people. Kakashi shook his head no to Pakin's question. I wish, he mumbled, finally pushing Yuhei off of him gently and scratching the pup's ears. Yurushi got the boy's attention next, pawing at his sleeve. What wrong? He asked, a slight whimper in his voice. Despite the way he looked, his eyes making him seem as if he was always angry, Yurushi was very caring to those he considered Pack. Kakashi shook his head. I'm not sure if you'd understand, he said. Girl troubles? Pakin asked, though he doubted it. He didn't particularly understand all the human rituals about dating and things, but that was pretty much the only thing he couldn't understand. That didn't make any sense though, because the only time Kakashi ever seemed to pay attention to girls was when they were enemy nin, and he had to kill them. Kakashi gave a choked laugh. No. Not girls. It doesn't make much sense to me, to be honest. I don't know how to explain it, and even if I did you'd think I'd gone insane, he told them. Insane? Yuhei asked, tilting his head in question at the unfamiliar word. I'll explain later, pup, Pakin told him, focusing on Kakashi worriedly. You can try. We'll listen, he said gently, pulling Yuhei back, despite the puppy's larger size, when he tried to start licking Kakashi again. Kakashi shook his head. I don't know where to begin, he responded quietly. Then just start talking. We can try and help, Pakin cajoled. He didn't really want to pry since it seemed Kakashi didn't want to share, but he wanted to help, and knowing what was going on was the only way that he could do so. Kakashi seemed uncertain, which made Pakin and Yurushi exchange uneasy glances. Yuhei didn't understand much about human emotion yet, and just sat there, waiting for Pakin to let him up since the pug was still holding him back from jumping on Kakashi. What do you know about time travel? Their summoner finally questioned. Minato's POV. Minato resisted the urge to sigh as he sat across from the Uchiha on his team. The boy was ranting about Kakashi. Again. How the boy thought he was so much better than everyone, and how he treated Obito and Rin like mud. Minato silently agreed with him that Kakashi's attitude was difficult to deal with, but this was partially Obito's fault as well. Once Rin had expressed interest in their new teammate, Obito had immediately started badmouthing him and had instigated one fight after the other in an effort to prove himself to Rin. And he said that with my intelligence I would get killed just stepping outside of the village, before our mission even started. Obito finished his rant, eyes starting to water slightly as he got worked up, and Minato winced. He had spoken with Obito's family on a couple of occasions, and they seemed to have the same thoughts Kakashi did about Obito. The future clan head Fugaku had been chosen about a year before, and had a lot to say as well, none of it good. He had informed Minato that had Obito not carried the Uchiha DNA, and therefore most likely the Uchiha bloodline, he would have disowned the boy. When Minato had spoken with Obito's parents, he had been surprised to find that they were even more critical. He figured he had learned where all of the bruises the boy definitely lied about had come from. They hadn't shared the same leniency as Fugaku had, and when they could do nothing about renouncing his name as an Uchiha, they had kicked him out of their home. His parents had given up on him after he'd had some eye problems, and had done poorly in the academy. At least, that's what he'd gathered from their conversation. Obito actually was in much the same position as Kakashi. While Obito's parents were still alive, they played no role in Obito's life. Obito was living in a rundown house in an annexed part of the Uchiha property. All of his money for food, clothing, and even weaponry came from the meager amount he made on their D-rank missions. Kakashi was slightly better off in that respect. He had money from his father to pay for things. Even if Kakashi refused to touch the money, it was still available to him should he really need it in the future. Other than that, he had been orphaned at a young age, and though Minato had taken him in, Kakashi still was insistent on being self-sufficient, and had distanced himself from Minato after gaining genin rank. In fact, Minato was pretty sure that the reason the two couldn't get along was because of how differently they'd grown from their circumstances. While Obito didn't know much about Kakashi's background, and Kakashi didn't know much about Obito's, they had both left very similar situations with very different personalities. Obito was loud and abrasive, constantly yelling that he was going to be the best, and demanding acknowledgement. However, he complained when training got too difficult, and gave up frequently to focus on his Uchiha training, which he insisted on doing privately. Kakashi wasn't interested in getting acknowledgement, just in getting stronger. Due to that, he put all of his effort into training, and refused to give up if he met resistance as he advanced. Minato was worried for both of them for these reasons. Obito would train a lot on his own, but he didn't look to Minato for help. He was determined to do everything by himself, so his ability for future, potentially dangerous missions, was uncertain. He insisted that he was an Uchiha and would train like an Uchiha, disregarding the fact that his relatives had been on teams and had been trained by people outside of the clan. Minato was certain that Obito's dismissal of assistants was in an effort to prove himself as skilled to his relatives, as well as to prove that he didn't necessarily need any help. Kakashi, while accepting of help, did nothing but train. Minato was half afraid that he would push himself much too far and become horribly injured. There was also the fact that he didn't ever take breaks and was always on guard, at least he had been when he lived with Minato. And that had been for an entire year. He'd been hoping that both boys would rub off on one another, that Kakashi would learn to relax a bit and have fun like Obito did, and Obito would get a bit more serious about training like Kakashi. That had fallen apart pretty quickly. At the first meeting, both boys had decided they couldn't stand one another, and the past 3 months had just made everything worse. Rin would sometimes run interference for them, but she had a crush on Kakashi that had only gotten stronger as time wore on, even though Minato and Obito were the only two to notice. Minato definitely agreed with Obito, even though the boy had been bad-mouthing Kakashi at the time. Kakashi wouldn't know a girl was interested in him even if she stripped down naked and crawled into bed with him. Because of her crush, even though she tried to remain neutral in their arguments, sometimes she sided with Kakashi. Even though she meant nothing by it, by doing this she helped the rift between them grow. Obito always blamed Kakashi when Rin would disagree with him, making him resent his teammate even more, especially since Kakashi brushed off Rin's affection so easily. Breaking out of his thought, he noticed that Obito was frowning at him in annoyance. Obviously he had missed something as he thought. He gave the boy a sheepish smile. "Sorry Obito, what was that?" he asked. Obito gave a huff and folded his arms across his chest. "I asked if we could get a C-rank mission soon," he said in irritation. Minato gave him a small half-smile. "Sorry Obito, but you all need a bit more work before you'll be ready," he said apologetically. Obito glared. "You even went on B ranks with Kakashi before Rin and I joined the team. Now you have more people so we should be better." "You just like Kakashi better than the two of us," he accused. Minato sighed. "That's not true Obito. It is true that we do have more people now, but think about it. You and Kakashi cannot get along, and Rin tries to stay out of them most of the time because she's not sure what to do. It's too dangerous to take a C-ranked mission at this point if you can't put aside your differences. You haven't even been able to go more than 2 weeks without failing a D-ranked mission because you're unable to get along. Until you can do at least that, I will not allow a C-ranked mission," he explained. Obito glared at him and then went into another rant about how Kakashi's attitude was the reason for all of their failures and that the boy was holding them back because of it. Rin's POV. Rin was a bit confused when she arrived at the training grounds that day. In all the months that she'd been on this team, she had never been the first to arrive. She didn't know what time he got there, but even on the first day as a new team, Kakashi had been at the training field, already training, when she'd shown up at 6. It was now 7:30, still half an hour before their team meeting, but pretty late by the silver-haired boy's standards. She decided to take a seat at the base of the large tree next to the bridge as always, and wait for Kakashi, as well as the other members of her team of course. When Minato arrived with Obito in tow, she started to worry. Kakashi wouldn't have blown off training if he could help it. He'd arrived when he'd had a cold one time, and trained until Minato had realized and forced him to go back home to rest. Judging by his expression, Minato was as worried as she was. "Ha! Now he can't make a big deal about me getting here late," Obito laughed, breaking the silence. Kakashi was always calling him out for being late, and the excuses that accompanied it. Rin figured Minato had either gone to Obito's house and brought him here, or today had been one of the days that Minato invited Obito to breakfast. Minato had been Kakashi's teacher since he was 5, and his guardian before that. Because of that, he knew the Hatake very well, and had felt that getting to know Rin and Obito would help him later on for their training and cohesiveness as a team. Rin had already met with him 6 times for breakfast, and this had been Obito's 6th time as well by her count had it occurred today. "Rin, Obito, you two stay here please. Start your warm-ups, I'll be having us do a mission. I'll hopefully be right back," Minato told them before taking off. Minato's POV. He was worried about his Chunin student, and he could tell Rin was worried as well, but probably not as worried as he was. Kakashi had shown up with a cold a few weeks after the team had formed, it was true. Prior to the team formation though, he'd come to training when he'd had such a high fever that Minato had been surprised he even remembered how to get to the training grounds. Kakashi had been hospitalized for a week in that instance, having caught pneumonia from training out in the rain, and he'd still insisted on a daily basis that he was fit for training. He soon reached Kakashi's house. It was an older house that was in need of a lot of repairs. There were parts of the original house, but most of it was newer from before the last of Tsukumo's extended family had died. Tsukumo hadn't really done much in the way of fixing it up, not a very good carpenter, and unwilling to pay someone to do it for him. Kakashi really didn't care about the upkeep after that, and only fixed something if he found it to be an issue. Minato hated this house. He hadn't wanted Kakashi to live here either after what had happened here. He remembered it vividly. He'd been woken up in the middle of the night by a messenger, informing him that his friend, and sometimes teacher, was dead, and that the Hokage was requesting his presence at the Hatake home since Jiraiya was out of the village. At first Minato had been afraid that Kakashi was dead as well, especially after learning that Tsukumo's body had been found in the man's study. He'd arrived at the scene and immediately an Anbu had passed over the distraught 4-year-old, insisting that Minato watch him so he wouldn't get in the way. Kakashi had been the one to find the body, and the woman who had just dropped him off after babysitting him had dragged him away from Tsukumo's corpse as he fought to get back to his father. An Anbu had arrived shortly after, having been sent to talk with Tsukumo about the possibility of a trial for his actions in his failed mission. He had quickly locked down the scene and called for people to investigate. The case had been closed quickly, the investigators hadn't put much of an effort into it, and it had been deemed a definite suicide by the next day. Minato was still surprised that Kakashi could live somewhere with such memories attached to it. Pulling himself from his thought, he sensed for Kakashi inside the house and was relieved to at least feel the boy's chakra. He quickly knocked on the door. Pakin's POV. When Kakashi had finished his story, both Pakin and Urishi were staring at him in horror. They believed him readily enough. Kakashi would never lie to them about something like this, and there was no way he had dreamt all of that. Yuhei had only understood part of the story, and when Kakashi had finished speaking he'd immediately moved onto the boy's lap to comfort him when he'd broken down into sobs, allowing Kakashi to cry into his fur, despite the chunin, or jounin, he guessed, having always insisted that was much too big for such things. Pakin leapt off the bed after Urishi had done so, moving to talk with him outside the room, giving Kakashi time to get himself under control. Truth, Urishi stated, and Pakin nodded. I know. The question is, what are we going to do to help? He asked. Urishi frowned. Stay with Kashi, he finally replied. Pakin had been about to respond when he heard the knock at the door. Urishi growled. Sensei, he stated before going back into Kakashi's room to warn him that Minato was there. Pakin moved to the door and pushed open the large flap that Kakashi had installed years before, just after getting Urishi. It was designed to accommodate a dog bigger than Urishi, useful since Yuhei was bigger than both of them. Pakin. I'm here looking for Kakashi. Is he alright? He's late to training, Minato said in greeting. Pakin tensed. Now that he thought about it, what would Kakashi want him to tell the blonde? Would he want him to tell the truth and say that the boy was crying? Would he want him to say that Kakashi was sick? If he did, then Minato would insist on entering the house. As he thought about his response, Minato knelt down to his level and scratched his ears. Minato was one of the only people besides Kakashi that he would normally allow to do this, not caring to be touched, and especially not by strangers. He had lived with Minato for about 6 months when he'd been a puppy, and the man had still visited Kakashi once in a while, though he hadn't stopped by in the past few months. I'm not sure, Pakin finally said. Minato stopped scratching his ears and frowned. Not sure about what? He asked in confusion. Is Kakashi here or not? Pakin nodded. He's here, but other than that I'm not sure, he responded. He was saved from continuing to misdirect the man's attention when Kakashi opened the door behind him. Kakashi? Minato asked in surprise. Looking up, Pakin could see that Kakashi's eyes were still red-rimmed from crying, and that he looked exhausted. Minato wasted no time in ushering him inside and closing the door behind him. Pakin sighed before climbing back in through the doggy door. Minato's POV. What the hell had happened to his student? He hadn't seen Kakashi cry since the night Tsukumo had died, but he doubted that Kakashi had cried after that point either. He'd been focused, to an unhealthy degree, on following the shinobi code. He harped on the one rule in particular that stated shinobi weren't allowed to show tears. He was further surprised when Kakashi turned and hugged him, burying his face into Minato's shirt as he cried. Despite his surprise, he returned the hug immediately as he raised an eyebrow in silent question at Urishi and Yuhei, who were sitting behind Kakashi. Yuhei just whimpered and Urishi's ears drooped sadly. Kakashi, what happened? He asked after allowing the boy to cry for several minutes. Kakashi pulled away, wiping his eyes. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have, he muttered. Minato frowned and shook his head. You're allowed to be upset, Kakashi. Now let's go into the kitchen. I'll make some tea and you can tell me what this is all about. Okay? He asked. Kakashi nodded meekly and led the man into the kitchen. Minato paused at the doorway and looked at Pakin. I know you'd probably rather stay here, but would you do me a favor? He asked. Pakin nodded immediately. You three are probably enough to take care of him for now. What is it? He asked. Rin's POV. She had been waiting with Obito for nearly half an hour, listening to the Uchiha complain about Kakashi. Meanwhile, she was worrying. She hoped Kakashi was alright. Even though she didn't really know him that well, she cared about him. True, she had a crush on the boy, and had ever since they'd been placed on the same team. He was a little cold to everyone, even to their sensei at times, but he took his duty as a ninja very seriously. Kakashi was pretty much the exact opposite of Obito. Even though Obito was striving to be a great ninja and achieve acceptance from his clan, he was almost never serious, and didn't seem to put much effort into their missions or group training. A dog? Obito suddenly asked in surprise, drawing her from her thoughts. In front of them there was a pug wearing a konoha headband and blue vest. Yo! He held up a paw in greeting. It can talk, Obito shouted in amazement, kneeling down in front of the dog and poking it in wonder. Rin's eyes widened. Obito, don't do that. It's a ninken, she cried in alarm. Obito looked over at her in confusion, finger poised to poke the dog again. Rin winced as a moment later the dog clamped down on the Uchiha's hand and he started screaming in pain. As soon as Obito had finished waving his hand around, trying to dislodge the dog, the pug released him and crawled a few feet away before turning to face the two. Yo. I'm Pakin. Your sensei asked me to work on your stealth and concealment techniques today instead of getting you a mission. The object is to hide from me for as long as possible. You both pretty much already fail since I have your sense, but try your best. If either of you stays hidden from me for an entire hour, I'll let you touch my paw pads. They're really soft, and really bouncy, he said, holding up his paw again to show them. Who the hell would want to do something like that? Obito demanded angrily, holding his throbbing hand. Pakin's eyes narrowed. Obviously not someone who smells like cat, he growled before stretching a bit. These are orders from your sensei as well, so you do well to comply with them. I don't agree to do things very often, you know, at least for people who aren't my partner. You should be flattered that I'm taking the time to help train you runts, he told them. And what if I refuse? You can't do anything to me, Obito told him, folding his arms and glaring at the pug. The next second he was screaming in pain again as Pakin attacked his ankle. Obito-kun, we should just do it. I mean, these are sensei's orders, and it would be really good training. Ninken are specialized trackers, so we'll learn a lot, Rin said, nervous to interrupt the pair. Pakin finally released him, and thankfully, the irate Uchiha grudgingly agreed. The pug observed them both for a moment. Alright, there are only a couple of rules, the first being that you can't leave the village, obviously. The second, you cannot enter any area which I am not allowed to enter. That means no Uchiha compound, he said, looking pointedly at the dark-haired boy. Obito just glared, arms folded over his chest again. The final rule is that you are to try and conceal yourself only. Attack me and I will report you to your sensei and maybe request that Urishi come along, and he's not as nice as I am. I will allow you to use things to attempt to trap me as long as they are only for restraint and not intended to cause me harm. The object of this isn't to take down a pursuer, but to make sure you aren't found in the first place, Pakin explained. Sounds fair, Rin agreed with a smile. Obito grumbled his agreement as well, and soon they had both left the pug to find a place to hide. Kakashi's POV. He wasn't all that happy about his current predicament. For one, he hadn't thought about how he would react to seeing his formerly dead sensei once again, alive and well, and hadn't had any time to prepare for such a thing. For another, Minato was now asking questions that Kakashi really couldn't answer. His ninken knowing all about his past, future, had been one thing, but Minato interacted with more than just him on a daily basis, and would have to report this information to the Hokage if he found out. Besides, his ninken blamed Obito for this, and if by some miracle the blonde believed him, he might think the same as his ninken and do something to the boy. Plus, even though it was selfish of him, he didn't want to deal with the possibility of being locked up if someone decided he'd gone insane from the pressure. He didn't want to be forced away from everyone when he had just been given a chance to spend time with them, no matter how much he didn't deserve such a thing. Yohei was currently sitting on the ground next to him, resting his head on Kakashi's lap. Urishi was too short to do that and had pulled over a chair before jumping up next to him and curling up, leaning against Kakashi as he did so. Kakashi absently rubbed Yohei's ears as he thought. Minato was at the counter making tea, back to him. He knew, though, that Minato was watching him out of the corner of his eye as he worked. After a lot of thought, he really only had one option for explanation, no matter how pathetic it made him sound. Minato soon placed a cup of tea in front of him and took a place across from him. So, have you calmed down a little? He asked softly. Kakashi didn't meet his gaze, just nodded. He wasn't sure if he could keep from bursting into tears again if he saw the concern on Minato's face. Did you want to talk about it? Minato questioned hesitantly. Kakashi figured that was about right. After he'd moved out of the man's house, any attempts at asking about his well-being were generally met with glares. He shook his head. I just had a nightmare. It's nothing, he replied. A shuffling sound across from him alerted him to Minato standing up and a hand under his chin forced him to look up at him. Kakashi, a nightmare isn't nothing, he insisted firmly. You don't have to talk about it with me if you don't want to, but I'm definitely willing to listen. I suppose there's no reason why I can't start changing things now, Kakashi thought. It was just about my dad again, he admitted quietly. Minato started, and Kakashi had to hold down a wince at the man's reaction. He was sure Minato was surprised that he was willingly sharing. He'd often told Kakashi that he would listen if he needed to vent, but Kakashi had never taken him up on the offer. Would you mind maybe telling me what happened in it? It might help, Minato asked cautiously. And with that, Kakashi started talking about one of the dreams he'd had frequently, even as an adult. Pakin's POV. Pakin wished that Yohei was here instead of him. The pups still needed to practice after all, and while these two genin were terrible at concealing themselves, they might provide a slight challenge to the greyhound since he more heavily relied on sight instead of smell. In the past 2 hours he'd found Rin 7 times, and Obito 12. It wasn't really that the girl was any better, though Pakin would swear that was the case if he was asked about it later. No, even if he logically knew the boy didn't remember his actions against Kakashi, it didn't mean Pakin was above punishing him a little. When he found them he would bite. Well, with Rin he would nip, but he took pleasure in hearing Obito's screams and would dig his teeth in as soon as he discovered the hiding spot, telling him it was incentive to do better. He deserved everything he got though, and so much more, for what he'd done to Kakashi. 3 hours later they took a break for lunch and Pakken sat happily next to Rin as she offered him some of the barbecue they'd gotten, ignoring the irate glares from the heavily bandaged boy across from them as he ate the treats and offered advice for further training. Minato's POV. Kakashi's nightmare wasn't as descriptive as the dreams he'd had when he was younger, but just as graphic. At least, when compared to the nightmares he'd heard about anyway. When Kakashi had still been an academy student he had been required to see a psychiatrist for several months, though he tried to get out of the appointments. He also hadn't been comfortable being alone in a strange room with anyone that he didn't know, and as a compromise Minato had sat in with him. Unfortunately, after Kakashi had graduated from the academy and been placed with Minato, he had refused to return to counseling. Minato had been so worried about losing Kakashi's trust that he'd let him quit going. Besides, it wasn't as if Kakashi had ever really said much, but as time had worn on he'd started to talk with the psychiatrist a little more as she picked at him. Minato had regretted allowing Kakashi to make the decision to leave, but Kakashi was extremely stubborn and definitely wouldn't have forgiven him if he'd forced him to return to counseling. Kakashi's previous dreams had been dark, usually playing out the exact events as they had occurred, at least from what Minato had learned from the reports and the witness. Sometimes they got a little worse, where sometimes Minato was also dead, or where Kakashi would be alone and nobody would be there to drag him away from the body, so he was forced to remain with the corpse. The one he described now was much worse than anyone should have to deal with, though Kakashi shouldn't have had to deal with the actual events either, and Minato was extremely glad Kakashi hadn't dreamt this sort of thing when he was 4. Kakashi had had difficulty coping as it was. Minato wasn't sure he would have been able to deal with this. This dream takes place before my babysitter got there, I think. I was in my dad's office with him for some reason. He was talking to me, telling me that I had to work harder, that he had disgraced the Hatake name, and that I had to fix things. Then he took the katana from the wall in his office and showed it to me. He said something about the honor of my grandparents and great-grandparents. Then he took it and slit his throat with it, then fell to the ground. I don't wake up then. He gets up and it sort of starts over again, but he's still covered in blood, Kakashi described distantly. Minato was silent for a few moments, not sure what to say since he'd never had any luck with comforting Kakashi in the past. Finally he made up his mind and stood, moving around the table and pushing aside Urishi, and then kneeling down and pulling Kakashi into a hug. He had hoped that Kakashi wouldn't fight it now that he was less upset, and he was glad to note that, after initially tensing, Kakashi leaned into it, shifting to hug Minato back. But that's not what happened, Minato said firmly. Your father loved you, and he just wanted you to be safe and happy. He felt Kakashi nod, and slowly pulled away. Are you going to be alright? Minato asked softly, kneeling next to the boy. Kakashi didn't meet his eye, but nodded again. Kashi okay? Yohei tried to clarify, giving Kakashi a suspicious look, as if daring him to lie. Kakashi gave him a small smile and held out his hand to the dog. I'll be fine, Yohei, he promised. Yohei eyed him critically for a bit longer before finally deciding he was telling the truth and dragged him out of the chair. He pushed Kakashi to the ground so that he was at a better level before proceeding to lick him. Urishi jumped from the chair and joined in. Minato grinned as they drew some laughter from the boy. Kakashi's POV. He felt a lot better after talking things over with Minato, even if he hadn't been able to explain the real reason for why he'd been so upset. It really wasn't the comfort, so much as the fact that this had never happened in the original timeline. Even though it wasn't something huge, he'd still changed something. With that knowledge he hoped that he'd be able to affect bigger things in the future. Even after he had assured the blonde that he was fine, Minato insisted on spending the rest of the day with him, saying that Rin and Obito were in good paws and could survive a day without him. After that, Minato invited Kakashi back to his home. He had a lot more food there, and had insisted on cooking lunch for the two of them. Kakashi didn't feel bad at all for skipping practice that day, wanting to spend time with Minato, since it had been cut short in the future. He was also half happy, and half afraid to see Rin and Obito again, not sure how he would react to them. Minato lived in a 2-bedroom apartment near the marketplace. Kakashi had rarely ever been there. The blonde had moved to this one a couple of years after Kakashi had moved out. It wasn't much, but it looked a lot more lived in than Kakashi's, since Minato didn't care as much about cleanliness and order as Kakashi had in the rooms that he did use. The next several hours consisted of Minato making them lunch, and them just talking. Unfortunately for Kakashi, it was about things that he really couldn't fully remember, but considering the answer to "what have you been up to?" at that age had been training, and that he didn't really deviate from a set routine, he could fake his responses relatively well. Minato's POV. Minato felt pretty horrible about how he'd been treating Kakashi recently. Since Rin and Obito had joined 3 months before, he hadn't visited Kakashi once, or even asked how he was doing, even though he'd been asking nearly every day before that. He hadn't meant to. It was just that he'd known Kakashi practically since the day he'd been born, and figured he should make an effort to try and get to know his new students just as well. Besides, Kakashi had always seemed to dislike when Minato would check up on him, insisting that he could care for himself. It was around 3 in the afternoon, in the middle of one of their conversations, when he saw Kakashi was drifting off, and just a little after that he was asleep on Minato's couch. Minato smiled when the two dogs curled up with him and maneuvered around them to cover Kakashi with a blanket before telling Urishi that he was heading out in case Kakashi woke up before he got back. Urishi just nodded in response. He couldn't keep his eye from twitching when he arrived at the training grounds to find Rin nursing a couple of bruises, and Obito lying on the ground, covered in bandages. Pakken just looked up at him innocently and raised his paw in greeting. "Yo, welcome back," he greeted, as if nothing had happened. "What happened?" Minato demanded after he'd collected himself. "This dog's crazy. He kept biting me whenever he would find me." "Tell me you didn't tell him he could do that," Obito moaned. Minato sighed and turned to Pakken. "I asked you to train them, not kill them," he said in exasperation. "I wouldn't kill your students, only maim or seriously injure them," Pakken stated, smirking at the fallen boy. Minato face-palmed. "You can go to my house if you want. Thank you for your services, I doubt we'll need them again," he said. Pakken shrugged. Hey, he should have hit himself better once he knew what to expect. "It's not my fault he didn't seem to learn," Pakken replied lazily as he began to walk off. "Blood helps you track things." Biting him made it easier to find him, Minato cried after him. Pakken turned back, eyes wide. Minato figured it was because he'd been caught. "No comment," he answered and raced off quickly. Minato shook his head in exasperation before turning to his students. "Obito, I'll help you to the hospital. Rin, you should head home. Your bruises don't look that bad and should heal relatively quickly. Training's going to be in the afternoon tomorrow, but Obito, if you aren't up to it I'll understand," he said, wincing in sympathy as Obito nearly fell over as he tried to rise. Rin could have gone to the hospital with them, but using chakra to heal injuries was both a good and bad thing. If small things like bruises or cuts got healed too often, then the body would expect to be healed by chakra rather than naturally, which was dangerous. Therefore, only injuries that would be detrimental long-term, or caused a great deal of pain, were to be healed with chakra. "Sensei, is Kakashi-kun okay?" Rin asked as he started off with Obito. Minato turned as gave her a short nod. "He'll be fine. He should be here tomorrow," he answered. She smiled in response, and he was glad that she didn't read too much into his words, not meaning for them to have come out that way, as if Kakashi wasn't fine now. Rin turned and waved goodbye, then took off, presumably to go home. Kakashi's POV. Kakashi woke up to the weight of Pakken as the pug climbed onto his chest. "Hey pup, sorry to wake you up. Did you have a good talk with your sensei?" the pug asked softly. Kakashi nodded. "I'm feeling a bit better about this, I think. The first time I upset sensei a lot because I brushed off his attempts to look after me, so I figured I could try and make up for that even if it's not necessary. I'll have to move a bit slower with making things up to Obito since he definitely doesn't trust me, and will probably get suspicious if I just start being nice to him. Rin, I'm not sure. I didn't really talk with her much before Obito's death, and she was polite afterwards, but I could tell she was angry that I wanted to leave her behind. After she left the village she just sent status reports. Nothing really about herself. That was after everything though, so I'm not sure how to interact with her now," he explained. Pakken just nodded, shifting to make himself comfortable. "I'm not sure how I feel about the Uchiha, but it's up to you how exactly you choose to interact with him. We'll help you out too, I guess, and we can make a plan later. For now go back to sleep," he ordered. Kakashi gave him a small smile and a short nod. He figured it had something to do with the time travel because he was never this tired normally. He drifted off almost immediately as soon as he closed his eyes. He next woke to the familiar smell of ramen being cooked. Naruto had often made ramen whenever Kakashi would visit him around mealtime, and even though he had usually refused it, he definitely remembered the scent. It took him a moment to remember that he wasn't in his former student's apartment, and a bit longer to convince himself that nothing that had happened earlier had been a dream. Once he'd regained his bearings, Kakashi gently woke Pakken and the pug crawled off of him, allowing him to sit up. Urishi and Yuhei might have been woken up as well, though Kakashi doubted they'd been asleep the entire time, and one of them had probably been fully awake. They liked to take turns keeping watch over him when they were in the capacity to do so, even when they were safely in the Hataki home, so it wasn't strange that they would do this in Minato's apartment. The two moved to allow him to rise. Kakashi yawned and then stood, making his way tiredly to the kitchen. "Hey Kashi-chan," the redhead woman at the stove greeted him. He was a bit surprised to see Kushina there. He was only 9 according to the dogs, and he hadn't thought his sensei had gotten together with the redhead until just before his jounin exams. Kakashi opened his mouth to reply, before mentally slapping himself. He couldn't call her Nei-chan yet, he hadn't started that until after she'd started dating Minato, and had bullied him into it. "Uzumaki-san," he greeted politely instead, giving her a short bow. He winced when she moved rapidly in front of him, and then flicked him in the forehead. It's Kushina, okay Kashi-chan. I've already told you several times, she chided before moving back to the ramen. I hope you're hungry. Minato Baka said you're staying for dinner so I made enough for you too. Can your dogs eat ramen? She asked. Kakashi mentally sighed in relief. He had been a bit worried that maybe he was either remembering things wrong, or that things had happened differently than how they had for him. That wasn't the case. Kushina had stopped adding Baka to Minato's name after they'd gotten together, unless the blonde ended up doing something extremely stupid. It looked like they were still friends for now. Kakashi flinched and instinctively jumped back when he felt a hand press against his forehead and looked up to see Kushina looking at him with a slightly worried frown. You zone out. You never zone out, Kashi-chan. Are you feeling all right? She asked him. Kakashi nodded quickly. Fine, sorry. My dogs shouldn't eat ramen. It's not good for them. I'll get them something when I go home, he answered. She was still frowning, but she just gave a short nod and went back to the stove and removed the ramen from the heat. Kakashi was relieved that she was making ramen rather than anything else. He'd been surprised he'd survived the encounters with her other attempts at cooking. She had been that bad when she'd first started. That was why Minato usually cooked if possible, and Kakashi always made sure to have good reason on hand for why he couldn't eat with her when the blonde wasn't around and she'd invite him over. That had changed though, when she'd started practicing more and more, eventually becoming a pretty good cook. Soon she filled 3 bowls with the ramen, before taking them to the kitchen table and setting them down. How about you start eating, Kashi-chan? I'll go get Minato, she offered. Kakashi nodded and sat down, waiting for the ramen to cool enough for him to eat. The two soon entered the kitchen. You're awake, Minato greeted with a smile. Kakashi just gave a short nod, fighting back a yawn. Minato shrugged. Well, let's eat, he decided, taking his seat while Kushina took hers. The 3 dogs were now in the kitchen, sitting next to the 3 and looking up at them with innocent begging expressions. So cute, Kushina squealed at Yuhei, looking to Kakashi and holding up a piece of chicken, looking at him in question. Kakashi nodded. Not too many though, he warned as Kushina handed it to the greyhound. Yuhei accepted it from her carefully. Hey, what about us? Pakken asked indignantly. I was informed by Obito that Rin gave you some of their barbecue. If you keep this up, have to roll yourself back to Konoha to deliver reports, Minato teased. Pakken glared at him before slinking away, muttering about snitches. Oh, that reminds me. Obito won't be at training tomorrow. Pakken sort of mauled him, Minato told Kakashi sternly. Kakashi raised an eyebrow, immediately figuring out what exactly Minato meant. I haven't talked about him with my ninken really, just that he's on my team. He is an Uchiha though, and they have those kneecats. That might be why, he said with a shrug. That was actually true. Kakashi never actually talked about his team, even to complain, at this point anyway. Inwardly he was cursing. Pakken probably figured he was doing the right thing, but the second that Obito learned that Pakken was his ninken, he'd accuse Kakashi of making the pug injure him, as Minato seemed to be thinking he had. He hit a wince when he noticed Minato didn't seem to believe him, but the man dropped the subject, turning to tell Kushina that the ramen was excellent. At that, Kakashi started feeling worse again. He'd never lied to Minato in all the time he'd known him. If he wanted something hidden from him, he would just say that it wasn't the man's business. Even the times he'd insisted that he was fine, he had been telling the truth as far as he knew it. Did the man think he had lied to him in the past? He stayed quiet through the rest of dinner, and after he'd put his bowl in the sink he turned to the 2. I'm going home. I'll see you tomorrow, sensei. He moved past the 2, called his ninken, and left. He had a good excuse for his silence though. He had rapidly become tired again, and hoped that after he woke up tomorrow he wouldn't need as much sleep as he had been. Minato's POV. He was a bit confused at how abruptly Kakashi's mood had shifted. Was it because Kushina was there? Sure, she teased him a little, but he didn't think Kakashi had taken anything personally. Kakashi was tired, and he could see it in the boy's features, but he'd been trying to force himself to stay awake earlier, and had been replying to all of Minato's questions. So when Kakashi opened the door, he said a quick goodbye to Kushina and raced after the Chunin. I'll walk with you, he said quickly, moving to walk alongside him. So, I told Rin you're going to be at practice tomorrow. Will you? Minato questioned. Kakashi nodded. I probably shouldn't take another day off so soon, he said, watching the path ahead instead of turning to answer Minato. He frowned at how distant the response sounded. You will be soon though, right? To train Yuhei? He asked. Yuhei yipped in excitement at hearing his name, and Kakashi absently scratched his ear and nodded again, not verbally responding. A few more failed questions later, they were at Kakashi's house. I'll see you tomorrow then, Minato told him hesitantly. Kakashi didn't answer with more than a short nod before letting his ninken inside and following them in. Minato opened his mouth to say something, but the door swung shut behind the boy immediately. With a shake of his head, he decided not to press Kakashi for details and started back towards his house. When he got inside, he found Kushina cleaning up the mess. He winced as a bowl hit the floor and shattered. I can do that, Minato said hesitantly, worried that she might take it the wrong way, like he was calling her clumsy or something. It would have been true though, even though she was a great ninja, Once she was off duty, she was probably the clumsiest person he had ever met. To his relief, she just turned to him and nodded. Sorry about that. I made the mess, so I was trying to clean up after myself. So do you want to tell me why Kakashi-chan was asleep on your couch earlier, or is it something private? She asked. Minato sighed. It was something private, but I don't understand. He was talking to me earlier today just fine, but then at dinner he sort of shut down again, he told her in worry. He wasn't prepared for the spoon that flew at him from the kitchen and struck him in the forehead. Luckily it was one of the wooden ones, not a metal one. You idiot. How the hell could you not tell? I didn't say anything because Kashi-chan was here at the time, and you're his sensei, so you should have figured it out. I also guessed that you didn't want to be yelled at in front of your student, but it looks like you're really dense if you still don't understand, she fumed. Minato's eyes widened. An angry Kushina usually meant a hospital visit for whomever she was mad at. How about you just calm down and tell me, he requested nervously. She continued to glare at him before taking a seat on a chair. Minato took a seat on the couch. You've pretty much raised Kakashi since his father's death, correct? And that means you know him extremely well, and he knows that, correct? She demanded. Minato nodded, uncertain of where this was going. And how often does he lie to you? Was the next question. Minato frowned. How should I know? He's pretty good at covering himself, so it's hard to tell, he said. Kushina glared. You really think that? Did you see his face when you pretty much accused him of lying about Obito's injuries? He was crushed that you didn't believe him. That's what was wrong with him, and why he got so quiet and distant all of the sudden. You even treated it like it was an everyday sort of thing, just brushed it off like you were expecting it, she snapped. Minato winced. That was why Kakashi was upset. Kakashi had always had something against Obito, and he just figured that he'd badmouthed the boy enough to his ninken that the pug had taken it upon himself to attack him when he'd been given the opportunity. It looked like that wasn't the case though, and he felt terrible. He'd just gotten Kakashi to open up to him after working on it for the past 5 years, and now he'd gone and ruined things again. Making up his mind, he rose from the couch. I'll go apologize, he said immediately, heading for the door. He was stopped by Kushina racing to the door and standing in front of him. No, you don't. He wasn't just upset. Even though he got a pretty long nap, he looked exhausted. Let him get some rest, and in the morning talk to him. He'll be at the training grounds early, right? Talk to him then, she insisted. Kakashi's POV. He brushed off his dog's concern as he filled their bowls and then went to his room and climbed into bed tiredly, not even taking the time to brush his teeth or change. He barely had time to feel the dogs climb up on the bed with him before he was out. The next morning at training he got started with his old routine. His body was a lot smaller, and his chakra was a lot less than he'd had in the future, and he needed to get up to the same level a lot faster and then surpass it if he were going to be able to do everything he needed to in the future. Of course, the first thing was to get used to his smaller stature before he would be able to do anything. He figured that wouldn't take too much time. He had been doing just fine with walking around and knowing how far he was able to reach. It would only get him into trouble if he misjudged one of his techniques, or even misjudged an enemy's technique. Neither of those were things he could afford to do. He had just destroyed the training dummy when Minato arrived. Kakashi frowned at that. Minato was never there before Rin. Looking around, he confirmed that she had yet to arrive. That was good. While he didn't mind Rin being there, had he not sensed her he would have been a bit worried. He'd been zoning out a lot, but to not notice someone coming, even if they were a friend rather than an enemy, could end up putting him in a lot of danger. He hoped that he would adjust to everything happening soon, because he was sure his constant recollection and exhaustion were what was causing this, and if he were on a mission he could get in serious trouble for it. Looks like we'll have to get a new one of those, Minato commented, surveying the damage before turning to Kakashi. Come over here and take a break, the blonde requested. Kakashi sighed, knowing where this was going. He was going to get in trouble for Obito's injuries. Deciding to just get it over with, he moved over and sat down across from the man who had taken a seat in the grass. So, nice day, Minato started, and he seemed to be slightly nervous. Kakashi raised an eyebrow in response. He was used to seeing Minato nervous. The man had been a wreck when he'd been thinking about asking Kushina out, and then much worse when he'd been worried about his proposal. He just wasn't used to the nervousness being directed at him. It had only been on one occasion after all. He tensed a bit. Was he getting kicked off the team for this? He had once before, and Minato had acted the same way then. He'd been in a horrible mood that day, and Obito had been getting on his nerves more than usual. Kakashi had injured him pretty badly before Minato had intervened on their spar, and then he'd said a lot of things that had definitely crossed the line, telling Obito that his parents should have drowned him at birth, and that he didn't blame Obito's parents for not wanting him. He'd been removed from the team for over a month before Obito had requested that he return even if he wouldn't apologize. Kakashi's pride hadn't allowed him to say that he was sorry, not that he had been at the time. The month that he had been off the team had caused a drop in the number of missions that Team 7 could take since most required a full team of 3 students. That meant that Obito's only income had been decreased more than half of the amount he had normally made, and he had finally needed money so badly that he had foregone the apology. Kakashi tensed and shifted suddenly, pushing the hand away and throwing himself backwards several feet when he'd felt a touch to his shoulder, his right hand finding his weapon's pouch and wrapping around a kunai. He cursed in his head once again for spacing out as he saw Minato look at him in surprise, hands still outstretched. "Kakashi? Are you alright?" he asked worriedly, dropping the hand back into his lap. Kakashi forced himself to calm down, his heart rate having sped up quickly as his body prepared for a fight. He nodded after a moment, releasing the weapon and taking his seat again. Minato was still looking at him strangely, but thankfully it seemed like he would put aside that talk and focus on why he was there for now. Kakashi tensed again, preparing himself for the dismissal. "Look, Kakashi, I'm sorry about last night. I didn't mean to accuse you of anything. It's just that you don't seem to get along with Obito at all and I figured you'd jump at the chance to do something like that," he said. Kakashi blinked at him stupidly for a moment. That's what this was about. Relief flooded him. He was still on Minato's good side. "I do not care for Obito's actions, but he is a teammate and injuring him will only set us back in training and missions. I would have nothing to gain," he responded. He thought the same thing when he was younger, of course, usually holding back in all their spars except in that one instance so they wouldn't have to put training or missions on hold, so that they could get to higher ranked missions sooner. It didn't always work since Obito would still insist on fighting after he'd been injured almost too much, but in general it worked out. Unfortunately, he couldn't have a change of heart about Obito too soon. He couldn't tell Minato that he was just fine with Obito now. Obito would be suspicious of him, and he was sure that one of his teammates would start looking into things, and maybe learn about Kakashi's trip to the past, or even become suspicious enough to have him locked up as an imposter. He was actually sort of surprised that Minato hadn't had any suspicions about him since he was acting so out of character, but figured that for now Minato was probably blaming everything on his nightmares. Sure, Kakashi was broken from his thoughts again, this time by Minato calling his name, a frown in place. Apparently he'd been trying to get Kakashi's attention for a while, deciding to try and break him out of his thoughts a different way this time in case Kakashi didn't come back to his surroundings in time and followed through with his attack. "Did you get enough sleep last night? You still seem sort of out of it. I can send you home again for today," the blonde offered. Kakashi shook his head. While he still felt a bit tired, he could hold out until he was able to go home before he would crash again. He also wasn't feeling as tired, so he counted that as a plus. He figured whatever the effects he'd received from the time travel, they would be over soon. "I'm fine, sensei, really. Just thinking is all." "Don't worry about it," he requested. He didn't want Minato worrying about little things like that. Minato shook his head in response. "Of course I'll worry about it, Kakashi. You're my student, and I really should have taken you at your word rather than accuse you of lying," he insisted. The two fell silent for a moment. "So, am I forgiven?" Minato asked sheepishly. Kakashi raised an eyebrow. He had pretty much just said that there really wasn't anything to be forgiven, but nodded anyway, knowing Minato needed it. Minato grinned in relief. "Okay then, I'll be back in a little while with your D-rank missions for today," he said, rising and brushing grass from his clothing. Kakashi nodded. Alright. Soon, Kakashi moved on to tree climbing. While he figured his chakra control was about at the same level, and maybe even better since he had a lot less chakra to work with now, he needed to make sure that he wouldn't over or undercompensate the amount that he was using. Unfortunately, he was right. He could do just fine as long as he was focusing on the amount he was drawing out, but unlike in the future, he wasn't able to do this without thinking about it. It wouldn't take much, but he still would need to practice. He moved back to the ground when Rin arrived. This was the tree that she sat under before practice started after all. "Good morning, Kakashi-kun," she greeted with a smile. Kakashi inclined his head in greeting. He never replied to her greeting at this time, and she was probably surprised that he even acknowledged her, but that didn't really matter much to him right now. He would have responded verbally had he been able, but his throat had closed up, his mouth had gone dry, and he was trying to force back the tears threatening to fall at seeing her again. He hadn't seen her in nearly 17 years, at least, in person. She was just like he remembered her, from before everything had happened. She wore a smile on her face as she normally did in his presence. Well, sometimes she wore one of exasperation or nervousness when he would fight with Obito. Her brown hair, which she had cut shorter when she'd become a chunin, was tied in a ponytail at her back, having grown out since the academy. Her clothing was light brown with shuriken patterns on it, and instead of the backpack that she'd worn as a chunin, she had several pouches on a belt at her waist. She had chainmail armor just under her shirt, something that most of the new genin wouldn't think to wear, still not fully understanding all of what it meant to be a ninja. Around her waist was a light purple apron skirt. Kakashi turned away quickly when he saw her watching him warmly. She shouldn't be looking at him like that. Even if she didn't know what he would end up causing in the future, she should at least dislike him for how dismissive he was of his two teammates at this point in time. "Kakashi-kun, were you sick yesterday? We miss you at practice. Rin spoke up again, and Kakashi felt the self-loathing well up again at the kindness in her voice. He nodded, refusing to turn to her. He needed to keep his emotions under control, but even with all the time and effort he'd spent into forcing back his emotions as a child, nothing he tried seemed to be doing him any good. Well, I'm glad you're back. Though I'm not sure you would have enjoyed it. We had to try and conceal ourselves. We got bit whenever we got found, and Obito got kind of beat up by that dog Sensei asked to train us, she said. Kakashi winced, and hoped she didn't notice that. He won't be training with us again, Kakashi informed her, thankful that he could keep his voice even. Oh, did Sensei tell you about it? He was an alright teacher. He gave me some pointers on hiding, but Obito had to go to the hospital by the end of the training, Rin said, sounding a bit surprised. Probably because Kakashi was holding a conversation with her. Pakken mentioned something about it, he said, reaching into his pocket and digging around for some cash. Minato had said she'd given him quite a bit of her meal. Steeling himself, he turned to the girl as he pulled out the money. Sensei told me that you fed Pakken some of your lunch, he said. Rin looked at the money in surprise before looking back at him. Pakken's your ninken? She asked. Kakashi nodded. One of them. This is for the food, he told her. Rin smiled and shook her head. That's not necessary. I offered it to him, and he helped me out with my training quite a bit. I wouldn't mind training with him again if he would be gentler with Obito, she told him. Kakashi nodded, pocketing the money. This was good for now, focusing on his ninken he could do, though he would still try to keep from meeting her eye just in case. Sorry? Kakashi asked when he spared a quick glance to see Rin looking at him expectantly. I asked about your other ninken, she said. Yurushi and Yuhei, he stated, and then described both of them a little. Rin smiled when he was finished. Well, if Yuhei needs more practice I'd be willing to have him track me, she offered. Kakashi nodded. He would probably like that. I'll ask him tonight and see what he thinks, he promised. Rin's smile widened and she nodded. Their conversation was cut short when Minato arrived with a mission. It turns out there aren't many missions for teams with just 2 ninja instead of 3, so you're going to be weeding a garden, and then you'll have the rest of the day off, Minato explained. Then maybe I can help with training Yuhei today if that's alright, Rin commented. Kakashi nodded in response, not missing the look of disbelief on Minato's face. Minato's POV. Minato was a bit confused about what was going on. First he'd found that Rin and Kakashi had seemingly been talking with one another before he'd arrived at the training ground, and as they worked Kakashi was answering Rin's questions with more than one-word responses. Politely. The Chunin had even asked a question or two of his own when there was a lull in conversation. Had his dream really affected him that much? He understood why Kakashi had been a bit clingy the day before with him. Minato had been there for him after his father's death. Kakashi had been attached to him before Tsukumo's death as well, and even after, Kakashi had definitely worried about him. Whenever he would get a mission and had been forced to leave Kakashi with a babysitter, the boy wouldn't get any sleep while waiting for him to return. Not that Kakashi would ever admit that. Sensei, Rin called, finally getting Minato's attention, seeming to have been trying to get his attention for a little while now. Oh, sorry Rin, are you finished? He asked, looking over their progress to see that they were done. He must have been thinking for longer than he thought. The garden was huge, and would have taken at least an hour to weed. Yes, Sensei. Now are we dismissed? She asked eagerly. Apparently Kakashi was serious about letting Rin train with Yuhei, which meant she got to spend more time with her crush. Rin also liked animals, so this would probably be a lot of fun for her, and good training so she could further learn what she needed to do to conceal herself. Yuhei was more of a sight hound, and while he was training for scenting, he was better at seeing movement and things that were out of place rather than just relying on his nose. Tracking by scent was necessary for him to learn though, since he was primarily going to be tracking people and things that weren't close enough for him to detect by sight alone. His other role on the team was chasing down his prey, being the fastest because of his longer legs. Unfortunately for him, he wasn't as good as he could be since he was too large and heavy to move through trees like Pakken and Yurushi were able to, but he more than made up for it with his more unique skills. Alright, I'll see about getting Obito to come tomorrow. Then you've got a day off on Friday because I need to take Kakashi to get his birthday present, Minato said. Rin was startled by that and turned to look at Kakashi questioningly. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to respond. He was busy looking at Minato in surprise as well. Minato sighed and shook his head. One of these years you're going to remember your birthday. Now, I was going to keep it a secret until Friday, but Inizuka-san said that you should have what exactly you're looking for in mind. I'm getting you 2 more ninken. This time though, you're picking them out, Minato told him. The expression Kakashi wore at that was a bit strange. Was that relief? Pushing that aside he dismissed them. As he watched them leave he frowned. After yesterday he had kept a closer eye on Kakashi. He seemed to be doing alright, better than he had in the past several years in fact. The abrupt personality change was bothering him a little. However, there was something he was more worried about. Kakashi didn't seem to be using his left eye much. It didn't seem like the boy even noticed, but he was constantly closing his eye as he worked that morning, and even when the two had spoken the day before he'd done the same thing. He didn't seem to be in any pain, and so Minato would wait a little while to start worrying over it. Rin's POV. Rin was sort of worried about Kakashi. Sure, she was glad that he was now speaking to her, but this was definitely out of character for him, especially how he kept turning away from her. Several times she'd seen his eyes become misty, as if he were about to start crying. That was part of the reason that she was glad that she could help him out with his ninken. While she would love to spend time with him, just for the sake of being around him, she hoped that she could find out what exactly was wrong, or at least cheer him up. Minato had surprised her when he'd mentioned Kakashi's birthday. Kakashi hadn't been in the academy with her class for very long before he'd been moved to a higher level since he was too advanced for the introductory class. Also, at the time she hadn't been interested in him. She was only 4. And unlike several of the other girls who were declaring their undying love for some of the guys in the class, Kakashi included, she didn't think about that sort of thing and they were definitely too young for it. When she'd been placed on his team was when she first developed an interest in him. He was a bit cold to her in Obito, but was very skilled and took being a ninja seriously, something that she admired. Apparently she wasn't the only one who was surprised by Minato's announcement. To a degree she sort of understood why Kakashi wasn't really all that interested in his birthday. For one, he was extremely focused on his ninja career and birthdays played no role in that. But for another, she knew that Kakashi didn't have a family to celebrate it with. Rin's mother had surprised her when she'd mentioned Kakashi was on her team, and had been slightly worried about meeting him because of that. The woman had told her all about Kakashi's father. How after Kakashi's mother died when he was just a baby, Sakumo had raised him on his own. Then the man had gone and caused a highly important mission to fail in order to save his teammates. Rin had been shocked when her mother had informed her that the man had thankfully realized that he was no longer fit to be a ninja and killed himself. Rin's mother was a civilian and usually held ninja in high regard. She had supported Rin's decision to become one, and even encouraged her. However, that didn't extend to Sakumo apparently, or Kakashi. She had warned that if Kakashi was anything like his father, that Rin had to be careful. She needed to make sure a mission succeeded no matter what. There was honor in dying for your village, but not in failing a mission. Rin disagreed completely. Had she been in Sakumo's situation, she might have done things a bit differently in regards to leaving Kakashi alone, but she would have done everything in her power to make sure her teammates survived. She didn't see honor in abandoning comrades just for recognition or completing a mission. That being said, she would have a very hard decision if the mission meant the difference between her teammates living or Konoha surviving. She just hoped she'd never be placed in that situation. The two had walked in silence to Kakashi's house. Rin would have liked to talk to him some more, but unlike earlier, he seemed to be deep in thought, and she didn't want to interrupt. They reached his home relatively quickly. You know Pakin, Kakashi pointed out when he led her inside the house. The pug raised a paw in greeting. Yo, he said lazily. This is Yurushi. Kakashi indicated a medium-sized dog, sitting next to Pakin. Rin wasn't sure what kind he was, but guessing he was probably a mix of things. The dog gave a short nod. Pleased to meet you, he said. She was a bit surprised. His voice had a slight growl to it, and his eyes looked mean, but he seemed pretty polite. And this one's Yuhei. Kakashi pushed the greyhound back to the ground as he bounced around excitedly. Hi Rin. Hi, he greeted, tail wagging happily as he turned to her. He was a lot bigger than the other two, probably just over a foot shorter than Kakashi by her estimation as the two stood side by side. Hello, Rin replied with a smile. Kakashi then took several minutes explaining to Yuhei what exactly the training was going to be. It seemed like he didn't understand as much speech as Pakin and Yurushi, so Kakashi made sure he understood. She was grateful that Kakashi instructed the dog not to bite her when he found her. Understandably, that wasn't how he'd been training in the practice hunts, but those teeth were huge. Then Kakashi turned to her. For some reason he wasn't meeting her gaze. He had been doing this the entire day. Right now he was staring over her shoulder. It's pretty self-explanatory, but do a mix of hiding in trees and on the ground since he really can't reach you in the trees. Pakin will be following behind. I'm going to stay here since Yuhei's test won't include me and he won't work as hard if I'm there since I can track you as well. Record how long it takes him to find you each time, and where you were hiding. Generally we stop after 10 successful finds, but if you want to keep going then you can. Just take a break every hour and make sure Yuhei gets back here for some water since it's so hot out. If he doesn't find you in 20 minutes, then call for a restart. If he starts taking a lot longer on consecutive hunts to find you then stop since there won't be much point in it once he starts to get worn out, Kakashi explained. And once you're done I'll let you touch my paw pads. And I'll tell you what you need to work on for concealing yourself better, Pakin added. Rin smiled at that. She found the paw pad thing kind of cute, though definitely meant for younger children. She had the strange thought that maybe it had worked with Kakashi when he had been little before dismissing it. He probably wouldn't take too kindly to being accused of something so childish. I'd be very grateful if you would, she told him instead of voicing her thoughts. She looked at Kakashi who was scratching Yuhei's ears as Yurushi pawed at his arm. The boy turned and ruffled the tuft of hair sticking up on the dog's head. Rin held back a grin. Even if Kakashi was being nice and talking with her, she also doubted he'd take kindly to her mentioning how much he seemed to care for his ninken. Kakashi turned to her. I'll let Yuhei out in 5 minutes so you have time to hide. Anywhere on or off the property is fine except for restricted areas like the Forest of Death and the clan compounds, he told her. It seemed somewhat hurried in her opinion. Rin nodded. Alright, I'll see you later then, she told him and took off. Kakashi's POV. Kakashi tried to hurry through his explanation with Rin. He couldn't with Yuhei since the dog couldn't really fully understand everything he was trying to say. The entire time they'd been weeding the garden, Kakashi had been constantly chanting. Just a little while longer, in his mind. He wasn't sure he would have been able to hold his tears back, but he managed. Though there were a few close calls where he had to start running through a list of all the techniques he'd known the first time around to distract himself. Of course he still knew the techniques, but his chakra capacity and chakra control weren't at a level where he could use them effectively. They would be much too dangerous and wasteful. When they'd finished their mission, he'd agreed to let her come along to his house even though that wasn't the best idea, because she had seemed so excited. He was glad when Rin had left the house. Holding his tears in for a bit longer, he finally let Yuhei out, with Pakken close behind. Had Yuhei seen how upset he was, he would have insisted on staying with Kakashi. Finally he turned towards his room, deciding that he couldn't hold them back any longer. He made it partway there before Yurushi raced ahead of him into the room, jumping up onto the bed and turning to him critically. Cry, sure, he ordered. That was all it took, and soon Kakashi was hugging Yurushi and crying into his fur, while Yurushi tried to comfort him the best he could. Minato's POV. Rin? Minato asked in confusion when he answered the door after the bell rang. She had never been to his house before, and didn't even know where it was as far as he knew. Sorry, sensei. I asked Pakken for directions, she told him in explanation. Minato was still frowning at her. She looked upset. Had something happened with Kakashi? He moved back to allow her entrance to the house. What's this about? He asked. Rin fidgeted a little with the hem of her shirt as she collected herself. What's wrong with Kakashi-kun? She finally questioned. Minato winced, hoping that he'd been wrong. What do you mean? Minato asked slowly. Rin bit her lip. I was helping with training, and I got done about 15 minutes ago, she started. Flashback in Rin's POV. She knocked on the door, but there was no answer on the other side. She'd brought Yuhei back, as well as Pakken, after half an hour because she was worried that Yuhei was panting way too much to continue, and Pakken had suggested he take a break and get some water. She frowned when, after a short while, there was still no response, and slowly pushed the door open, finding it unlocked. Kakashi-kun? She called out. Behind her, both Yuhei's and Pakken's ears twitched, and the greyhound raced ahead of her through the kitchen area to the hallway, and then into one of the rooms, scrambling to get traction on the wood flooring. You should head home. I'll give you pointers tomorrow, Pakken said beside her. What's going on? She asked in confusion. Pakken's ears twitched again. It's nothing you should concern yourself with, Rinchan. Just go home, he requested firmly. She'd been about to ask more questions when there was a crash in the room. Ignoring Pakken's calls to stop, she ran towards the sound. As soon as she got a good look into the room, she figured out exactly why Pakken was trying to force her out. Kakashi was sitting on the bed wiping his eyes. She could see that they were red-rimmed and his face had splotches from his tears. She backed away, trying to be silent. Finally she made it to the kitchen and found Pakken sitting there still, ears drooped. You should go home, he repeated, looking back and up at her sadly. What's wrong with Kakashi-kun? She asked. Pakken just shook his head. You shouldn't get involved, he replied. Rin frowned. Kakashi never really showed emotions other than exasperation with Obito, and sometimes her. Something had upset him enough to make him act like this, and she wanted to help. I should at least tell sensei, she argued, knowing she wouldn't be as much help as Minato would be, since their sensei had known Kakashi for much longer. Pakken sighed. The pup wouldn't want that, but you're right, it's for the best that he knows. He might be able to calm him down, he agreed. And flashback. And he didn't notice you? Minato asked, heading towards the door as he spoke. No. Minato-sensei. What's happening with him? Rin asked behind him pleadingly. Minato paused and turned, knowing that the smile he hoped was reassuring ended up being more of a grimace. I'm not sure, Rin, but he'll be fine, he told her, hoping that he was telling the truth, before heading out the door. She started to follow behind him, and he shook his head. Go home, Rin. I'll see you tomorrow and hopefully bring Kakashi with me, he said, sort of apologetic because he was leaving her out. Rin frowned. I guess, she agreed hesitantly. But make sure that he's okay, she pleaded, before racing off. I hope I can, Rin, he muttered when she was out of earshot, continuing on his way there. The door was unlocked when he reached it, and he entered, making his way past Pakken, even as the pug started to try to explain things, and into Kakashi's room. Kakashi? He asked. The three in the room looked over at him. I'm sorry, Kakashi muttered as Minato drew closer, sniffling and trying to collect himself. Apparently Minato's presence wouldn't allow for that, and as he had done before, Kakashi launched himself at the man, hugging him again. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, he mumbled again and again as he started to cry again. Sure, you're alright, Kakashi. You haven't done anything wrong, Minato tried to calm him, though it didn't seem to be working. Kakashi continued to apologize over and over. What exactly was he apologizing for? The only thing he could think of would be that he was breaking the shinobi code by crying, But Minato had always told him that several parts of the code were more of suggestions rather than something to rigidly adhere to. The one about crying wasn't applicable around comrades when there was no danger. Besides, Minato was sure he was apologizing for whatever he was crying about, and that wouldn't make any sense. Was he apologizing about Obito's injuries? Minato was sure he hadn't been lying, and Kakashi should have accepted his apology, so there shouldn't be any more discussion on that. He would have to wait until Kakashi calmed down, he figured, before he would be able to learn what was upsetting his students so much. That took a while. About half an hour later, Kakashi had moved away, apologizing, this time probably for using Minato for comfort. Minato reached out and ruffled his hair. "What's bothering you, kid?" he asked softly. Kakashi just shook his head, not responding, and refusing to meet his gaze. Kakashi's POV. Minato stayed for several hours after Kakashi had moved away. His tears had stopped, but he figured it was more due to not having any more to cry. He wished Minato would stop asking questions though. He couldn't answer any of them, and it was making him feel a lot worse. But more than that, he wished he could keep himself calm. His emotions were all over the place since he'd come back, and he just wanted everything to go back to how it had before. Him with his team and nothing getting in the way. His ninken had left very reluctantly after he'd insisted on being left alone, but Minato wouldn't comply with the request. He actually figured his ninken would have refused as well had Minato not been there. "Kakashi, do you remember Mari-san?" Minato finally asked hesitantly after a long silence. Kakashi nodded. "What about her?" he questioned. Mari had been the psychologist he'd been sent to after his father's death. He hadn't cared for her. She treated him like a child and hadn't helped at all. "I know you didn't like dealing with her, but would you be willing to give her another chance? Or even would be willing to see someone else?" "I think that it would help," Minato told him uncertainly. Kakashi flinched back from him at that. "You think I'm crazy," he stated. Minato quickly shook his head. "I don't, Kakashi. I'm just worried about you. This isn't like you at all, and you know that all I've ever wanted for you is for you to be safe and happy," Minato assured him. Kakashi mentally disagreed. This was almost exactly as he'd been in the future minus the emotional outbursts. He supposed Minato didn't know this version of him yet. It was true, though, that Minato would do pretty much anything he could to look after him. "They're civilians," Kakashi argued. While he wasn't going to refuse the request from his sensei, he wasn't going to go to be counseled by a civilian. They just couldn't understand ninja. Minato nodded. "I'm aware, and I have another idea if you don't want to speak with Mari-san, but you're going to have to hear me out," he said. Kakashi's eyes narrowed slightly, wondering where this was going since Minato was so hesitant. "Kakashi, you know of the Yamanaka clan, correct?" Minato questioned. Kakashi looked up at the blonde sitting on the end of his bed with a frown and gave a short nod. It wasn't like he could ever forget the Yamanaka clan. Even discounting the fact that they were a major clan, he'd had a run-in with them as a younger child and nearly made himself an enemy of the entire clan. "Do you know Yamanaka Inoichi?" Minato prompted. Kakashi's frown deepened. He didn't know how far back it had been since he met the man in this timeline, or if he had met him. Thankfully, Minato took his frown as confusion and started to explain. "He's an apprentice in the torture and interrogation department. Right now he's working in the hospital as a psychologist part-time, as well as from his home. He doesn't charge ninja to talk to him, and I think that you would benefit from it," Minato suggested. Kakashi shrugged. "But he is a Yamanaka," he stressed. That much he remembered. He hadn't been comfortable around them until Inoichi had approached him in the future and requested that he stop holding back on Ino in training when she'd started working under him. That the Yamanaka clan did not blame him for what he had done in the past, and that he actually had their support. He didn't think that was the case now, though, since it had been nearly 20 years in the future when the clan head had approached him. "Yes, he is, but the past is the past," Minato told him firmly. "Inori?" Kakashi asked. Minato winced slightly. "I'm not sure about her. She's definitely not one of your biggest fans, but that has nothing to do with Inoichi." "He's fair, Kakashi," Minato insisted. "You're sure?" Kakashi asked. Minato looked at him in surprise. "Yes, I'm sure." "You'll do it?" he asked. Kakashi nodded. "You want me to, so I will. I don't have to continue it if I don't like it, right?" He wondered, though he knew the answer. Minato wasn't forcing him into this, and he wouldn't force him to stick with it if he didn't like it. Minato shook his head. "Of course you don't. You don't have to share anything that makes you uncomfortable either, and Inoichi would never share anything you tell him unless it would put you or someone else in danger," he explained. Kakashi nodded again. "When?" he asked. Minato shrugged. "Soon, I'll let you know once I find out," Minato promised and ruffled Kakashi's hair. "Now come on, let's get something to eat," he said. Kakashi just nodded and followed him out. He didn't really mean to ignore Minato as he ate, but he was thinking. The incident with the Yamanaka clan had been just after he'd turned 5, and had been removed from his records for some reason. A girl in his class, Yamanaka Inori, if he remembered correctly, who was a cousin of Inoichi and his classmate at the time, had cornered him for some reason on the playground after school one day. He'd put her in the hospital. She'd slipped into a coma, and the clan had demanded Kakashi be thrown out of the academy for the attack, or at least barred from graduating as he was close to doing in the next couple of months. While the issue was still being investigated, Kakashi had been attacked constantly by the Yamanaka, some Akimichi, and though there had never been any proof, some Nara. The three clans had gotten close after first Ino Shikacho team had been formed, and saw the attack as something against their clans as well. Had Minato not been there, as well as some Anbu, he would have been killed. Inori had woken up a couple of weeks after he'd hospitalized her, and the attacks and threats had abruptly stopped. He'd never figured out the reason for that, but was just glad that he didn't have to deal with them anymore. He'd steered clear of the three clans after that point, still a bit wary. In the future, when he trained the second generation Ino Shikacho, all individually for a short period, and even fought alongside some of the clan members, there had been no time for hostilities, so he hadn't really considered them a threat at the time. Besides, so many of those clan members had been lost in the Kyuubi attack that he wasn't in as much danger as he had been before. Of course, Inoichi telling him all was forgiven had helped as well. He wasn't sure he wanted counseling. He had been to routine sessions after extremely dangerous and stressful missions in the future, but those weren't anything too personal. Minato wanted him to do it though, so he figured he owed it to the blonde. He'd refused counseling when he had been younger, and demanded to be dropped from it as soon as he'd become a genin. If he went back to counseling, he would be making things up to Minato a bit more. Puppy's POV. His ears had been flattened against his head since that morning, and he'd been shaking since the other dogs had woken up around him. While sometime in the middle of the night there had been a rare lull in noise from the other dogs surrounding them, now they were as loud as usual. Around him, his litter played excitedly. He stayed away from them the best he could. They had tried to pull him into a game before, and he'd gotten angry and bitten several of them. He had a couple of scars from where they had retaliated, and it was only because of the human that had caged them that he'd gotten off so lucky. His eyes widened as little human paws reached down and grabbed him. Whirling around, he snapped his teeth shut before he even saw his attacker. A scream made him release his hold as he flinched back in pain and fell several inches to the ground. Luckily, he hadn't been too high. The small human wailed and ran out of the cage that held him. The puppy had been about to make a break for it when the cage was slammed shut. The human outside the cage had been there every day to look in on them, his captives, and he barked something at the puppy viciously before leaving. While he had kept the puppy from worse injury, he wasn't a friend by any means. Looking around, he made his way to the back corner of his prison, turning so that nobody could sneak up on him from behind again, and gazing out warily as the humans made their ways back and forth, sometimes pressing their faces up against his cage. The smaller ones were the loudest, shrieking and whining at the bigger humans. 2 of his number had already been removed from the cage, and the rest had been paid a great deal of attention by the humans, even him. Fortunately, that ended quickly as soon as they met his teeth. He refocused his attention as the door opened again. This time a medium-sized human entered the cage, wearing something over his muzzle, unlike the other humans, and his fur was sticking up on his head in a strange manner. He found it sort of odd how humans only seemed to have fur on their heads. The rest of the fur covering them didn't seem to be attached. The medium-sized human smelled of dog, but not like the kennel's dogs. The scent he carried was of dogs that the puppy had never smelled before. Behind him were 2 other humans, though these were taller. One had fur sticking out all over, and the other had short, spiky fur. Those 2 stayed outside of the cage though, and the puppy focused his attention on the medium-sized human as he knelt, allowing the puppy's siblings to crowd around him. When he caught the human's gaze on him, his ears tightened against his head even more, and when a paw got too close to him, he snapped his teeth shut around it quickly, bracing himself for the pain. No matter what, whenever he bit someone he got a scream that hurt his ears a great deal, or got struck by the human. It was better than being forced to deal with the treatment his litter received though, so he continued to react in the same manner. This human was different from the others. He carefully shifted, picking up the puppy with his other front paw and settling him into his lap before gently prying open his jaw. The boy barked something in a soft voice to him, and the puppy stared up at him as the human's paw carefully moving down his back. His wonder was cut short as a scream sounded from the next cage and he snarled, lashing out and getting the human's arm this time. Once again, he was carefully removed, but this time instead of being left in the human's lap he was picked up and carried somewhere else. The puppy yelped in surprise, whimpering at the sudden change in height. He'd been dropped several times, some heights more painful than others, and this height would definitely hurt. No matter how much he struggled though, the human did not release him, and he found himself being set down in another cage as the medium human turned his attention to the dog present in that one. This other dog was a bit bigger than him and definitely not with the same build. He didn't seem to mind the human's observations though, and soon one of the other humans had appeared outside of that cage with 2 smaller cages. He snarled in response, tucking his tail between his legs as he watched them warily. He'd been in one of those before, along with 3 of his litter mates. It had been hot and crowded. He'd had trouble breathing as he was pushed into the corner by 2 of the stronger dogs and had been carried in it until they had arrived at this place. When the human's paw came towards him this time though, he wasn't able to sink his teeth in before the paw had moved around and grabbed him by the scruff of the neck. From there he was forced into the cage. No amount of barking, growling, or whimpering seemed to make the humans want to release him as he was carried towards the outside with the other puppy in a different cage. That one was sniffing at his surroundings eagerly, seemingly not upset in the least at their treatment. The humans barked at one another as they walked. The smallest one kept looking into the cages at them. Soon they were at another big cage place. At least that's what the puppy figured. It was bigger than the one he'd just been removed from, but he could smell and hear the other dogs nearby, most likely inside. His cage had been the only one that the medium human had been carrying at that point, but the other puppy was handed to him as well, and soon the human brought them inside. The other two humans left. He was set down on the floor near the doorway, and so was the other puppy, but unlike the other puppy, he wasn't let out. There were more dogs here, but they weren't in cages. They crowded around the other puppy, sniffing him and getting introduced. The one closest to his size made his way over, and the puppy growled and snarled at him until he backed off. Even though he was in the cage, he could have nipped the other pretty hard had he gotten close enough. The medium human had just sat there while the dogs introduced themselves, but after barking something at the small dog, and the small dog seemingly understanding the human, he grabbed the puppy's cage and picked him up again. Thankfully, the puppy didn't have to get too worked up because a moment later they were in another room and the cage door opened. The puppy quickly raced out, turning to look at the human warily. Instead of doing anything to him though, the human just sat down on the floor, not even looking at him. Kakashi's POV. He was glad that he had found the 2 ninken he'd received at this point in time. Kakashi had been worried that Minato might decide to postpone his trip to the animal shelter because of how he'd been acting, and he felt guilty about forgetting his birthday. He'd had a problem with remembering it most years since he really didn't care for it, but it was the date that he'd gotten all of his ninken, except for Pakin and Biscuit. The puppy he was currently shut in a room with, the gray puppy with a white underbelly and a brown spike of hair on his head, was Shiba. He had nearly not gotten this one since he'd been bitten the first time as well. It had taken some convincing from Sim to finally agree to adopt him. She had sensed that Shiba would be a great addition to his team once he was trained a bit, and he was one of the healthiest puppies there, excluding breeding since they didn't have the Mutz papers on record. It turned out that Shiba had extremely sensitive hearing and had been on edge the entire time he had been in the animal shelter due to the loudness around him, and lashed out because of it. After a couple weeks with Kakashi, he had calmed down, and had soon made friends with his other ninken. It had taken a while though. None of the ninken had liked that Shiba had attacked him on their meeting, and it had taken a bit of convincing to make them accept the puppy. The other puppy that he'd left with his ninken was Bull. He was very laid back, and had taken to Kakashi from the start. Of course, Kakashi would have to spend time getting the dark brown mastiff used to him again, but he hoped to gain Shiba's trust quicker than last time. The puppy had gotten pretty sick from refusal to eat because he had always been so cautious, as well as lack of sleep since every little noise seemed to wake him since he was so high-strung. Kakashi hadn't been as knowledgeable the first time around, and because of that, Shiba had suffered. So for now, Kakashi had decided to close himself in with Shiba for a few hours to get the dog used to his presence, and then gradually try to coax him over. He would have the dog sleep in his room as well, even if he made a mess on the carpet. The little puppy wouldn't attack him, even if he could jump up onto the bed. He was afraid of humans after everything he'd gone through. First he'd been given up, along with his siblings, then he'd been put in a place with sound that was constantly hurting his ears and making it impossible for him to relax even a little. And because he was so stressed he would bite people, and then their reactions always ended up causing him more harm. Minato had informed him after training the day before, after Rin and Obito had left, that he had spoken with Inoichi. The future clan head had agreed to meet with him, and at his house. He obviously knew that Kakashi wouldn't want to meet Inoichi at a place he'd never been before, and where he would be trapped with the man. At his house he had his ninken, so he would feel safer there, and Inoichi seemed to have figured on that. He sighed, hoping that everything would work out, especially since the Mind Walker was likely to figure out that he was lying about things. Kakashi had 5 days off of training, and he was going to work with Yuhei for several hours on his training, and get Bull and Shiba used to him because that was specifically why he'd been given time off after all. Well, probably not entirely. The first time around he'd been given 2 days. After the interaction he'd had with Obito the day before, Minato had thought it best that he take more time off than he'd originally planned. For now, he made a show of keeping his focus on a book he'd brought into the room with him, though he kept his gaze on Shiba out of the corner of his eye as well. Inoichi's POV. Inoichi didn't get surprised by much. It was difficult after all he'd seen in his profession. However, he couldn't deny that Minato had definitely surprised him when he'd approached him and asked about working with Hatake Kakashi a couple of days prior. He personally didn't have anything against the Hatake heir, and neither did anyone else in his clan aside from his cousin Inori. The thing that surprised him was that Kakashi still avoided people of the Yamanaka and Akimichi clan, and so agreeing to this was strange. Even after they'd stopped attacking him and had extended an apology, it seemed he didn't trust any of them. Inoichi should have been one of the last people he'd ever want to talk to. The Akimichi had taken a lot of offense to Kakashi's actions, and had immediately joined in on attacking him out of loyalty to the Yamanaka clan. True, the Nara had been attacking him as well, but they hadn't actively sought to kill him like the other 2 clans had, and so Kakashi seemed to be at least somewhat alright around them, though Inoichi doubted they were his ideal company. The only thing he could postulate at this time was that the boy must definitely need to talk to someone, if he'd agreed to talk to a Yamanaka of all people. In addition to talking about whatever Kakashi needed to talk about, Inoichi hoped to speak to him about the incident today as well. The Yamanaka and Akimichi clans, while not as large as the Uchiha or Hyuga clans, were made up of a lot of members, and if Kakashi was stressed out about something, then this would definitely lighten the load on him, if he didn't have avoid so many people. Currently he was walking towards the Hataki home. He'd been informed by Minato that Kakashi had been given 5 days off of training to work with his new ninken and was at home at the moment. That hadn't been the entire reason, Minato had confided. Apparently the Uchiha on the team had said some pretty terrible things and figured Kakashi would prefer more time off just to spend with his ninken. Of course, Inoichi wasn't sure how much that mattered considering Minato had ordered the Uchiha not to return to training until he apologized. But Minato knew Kakashi better than he did, so he hadn't comment. He knocked on the door and waited, observing the area around him. The house wasn't taken care of much from the looks of things, but he figured that while Kakashi strived for perfection in training, according to his file, he didn't hold all aspects of his life to the same degree. The door was apparently locked because he heard a click just before Kakashi opened the door. "Yamanaka-san," Kakashi greeted cautiously. "Just Inoichi is fine. Would you be alright with me just using Kakashi?" he asked as he stepped inside when Kakashi pushed the door open further and stepped back. He usually gave this offer when meeting with his clients. It was hard for people to see him as anything other than a jounin and clan heir. Doing away with clan names made things less awkward in most cases. Kakashi nodded. "That's fine," he responded as he shut the door, and then crouched to scoop up the small dark brown dog that had made his way over and was pushing at the door flap Inoichi saw had been installed for a pretty large dog. Kakashi turned to him as he scratched the dog's ears, and it panted happily. "We can talk in the living room," he said, before showing Inoichi to a room just off the side of the kitchen. There was a couch and a chair. That would have confused Inoichi a bit, but he could tell they were both pretty old and worn, probably from when Tsukumo had still been alive. Kakashi didn't strike him as the type to have more things than strictly necessary. On the couch, a light brown dog with a blue vest and a forehead protector around his neck was sleeping. As soon as Kakashi entered the room, though, his ears perked up. "Yamanaka," he stated, glaring directly at Inoichi as soon as he caught sight of the blonde, teeth slightly bared, and a growl present in his voice. "Yamanaka Inoichi, pleased to meet you," Inoichi greeted. While he had initially thought it strange to introduce himself to an animal, he had gotten used to it relatively quickly, especially after spending a bit of time around Inuzuka-tsu's Niken Kuramaru the other day. Like Kuramaru, this dog wasn't impressed in the least with him. "Hurt, sure, and I kill you," the dog growled before rising and moving to occupy one side of the couch instead of spreading out across the entire thing as he had done before. Inoichi raised an eyebrow, but wasn't too put out by the threat. He'd done a bit of research on Kakashi before coming here, and because he knew Kakashi was on good terms with the Inuzuka heiress, he had spoken with some about the boy, which was how he'd ended up meeting her ninken. It was strange to hear some talk so respectfully about anyone, especially someone below her in rank and outside of her clan. Apparently Kakashi was highly skilled at training ninken, and had impressed her a great deal. She had even said she would be willing to give Kakashi a dog that her clan had bred because it would be in good hands. Hell, she had mentioned that it was a shame Kakashi hadn't been born in Inuzuka with his skill. According to her, though she hadn't really seemed to want to admit to it, Kakashi was able to bond with his dogs better than even most members of her clan. They were exceedingly loyal to him, and Kakashi had even been able to train them to work independently in battle. Unlike the Inuzuka that had ninken partners and always fought side by side in battle, the older two dogs at least, were highly intelligent and capable of forming plans on their own. She had joked that if they were human, they would be members of the Nara clan. "Sorry about that," Kakashi said sheepishly as he moved to the couch so Inoichi headed for the chair. "No problem, I understand," he assured the boy. As soon as they were both seated there was a slightly awkward silence as Kakashi shifted in his seat nervously, even as the dog in his lap tried to make himself comfortable. From what he'd been told, this had to be Bull, one of the puppies Kakashi had just gotten. Inoichi was the first to break the silence, putting Kakashi out of his misery. "Alright, now usually this is going to be whatever you want to talk about, but I figured I should sort of clear things up if you're okay with it," Inoichi told him. Kakashi frowned. "Clear things up?" he questioned. Inoichi nodded. "About the attacks from my clan when you were younger," he clarified. Kakashi's frown deepened. "I understand. Inori is a relative of yours and I did harm her a great deal. Besides, I haven't been attacked since becoming a genin, and I guess all the charges against me were dropped." Now it was Inoichi's turn to frown. What exactly was the boy talking about? True, they had stopped almost exactly to the day that Kakashi had become a genin. Inori had woken up from her coma around that time and had been upset that she hadn't been able to take her final exams to get to the next level of the academy, and had also explained what exactly had happened between the two. However, Kakashi was acting as though all of this was his fault, and as though he didn't exactly know why the attacks had stopped, or why the Yamanaka clan was no longer trying to make him lose standing. "Of course the charges were dropped after we found out that you hurt her in self-defense. My father didn't explain this to you when he came to talk to you?" Inoichi asked. Kakashi's expression changed to one of confusion. "Self-defense? And I've never spoken with Yamanaka-sama," he answered. Inoichi sat back in the chair. He'd been leaning forward to read Kakashi's emotions, It was a bit harder because of the mask, and reading emotions around the eyes was a lot more subtle of an art, so he had to be a bit closer. As far as he was concerned, Kakashi was telling the truth as far as he knew it. Besides, he would know that Inoichi could easily confirm what he just said with his father if he had any doubt about it. That didn't make any sense though. Inori wouldn't have lied to the clan about what she had done in this case. She had developed a deep hatred towards the young Hatake, and would have done pretty much anything she could have to discredit him. No, Inori had definitely told the truth when she told them why Kakashi had nearly killed her. Inori's memory. She had just gotten out of class and run out to see the boy she'd developed a crush on. He had been in her class for a short while before he had been moved into a higher grade, and was just a little younger than she was. Now the only time she got to see him was when they were given breaks, and after class. As luck would have it, she found him around the back of the academy, and had rapidly approached him. "Hello Kakashi-kun," she greeted, blushing a bit when he glanced over at her. He didn't respond though, just turned and continued on his way. She pouted and caught up with him. "So Kakashi-kun, I was wondering if we could maybe train sometime," she suggested. While she would have rather done something else, she knew Kakashi liked to train, and after she showed him how good she was, she hoped he would ask her out. Kakashi paused, looking towards her in a bored manner. "I wouldn't train with someone so weak," he told her bluntly. Her eyes began to water, and she stared after him as he started to walk away. "This is because your father died, isn't it?" she demanded. That got his attention, and he turned to her quickly, eyes narrowing. "You won't let yourself be happy, so maybe you should just forget about it," she told him, starting through some hand seals. She'd read a lot about this technique. It allowed the user to view and affect a person's memories. All she had to do was find the memories Kakashi had of his father being dead and erase them, then he would be happy. She'd gotten to the last hand seal when she screamed in pain. Kakashi had interrupted her technique by slamming his foot into her stomach and throwing her back. From there the pain only increased and her vision blurred until everything went black. End memory. Kakashi was lucky that she hadn't had time to complete the technique. Inori had been 6 and Kakashi had just turned 5. Even though Inori was smart, she really didn't have much skill with techniques. What she had tried would have, at the very least, stunted Kakashi's mental development, and at the age of 5, he would have never progressed any further. The worst, and the most likely scenario, she would have shattered his mind completely. Had she succeeded by some miracle, Kakashi would have had to go through the process of losing his father all over again, and this time he wouldn't have had any idea why. There was also the issue of using a technique on an ally without permission. That was why, after Inori had explained everything, she had been punished even further for her actions, especially since she had still insisted that she had been doing the right thing. For all of these reasons, Inoichi was confused. Kakashi had had every right to do what he had done, and the clan fully supported his decision. Inoichi's father had even spoken with Sim, who had been running the clan store, about him paying for all of Kakashi's supplies for his ninken in apology for both Inori's and the clan's actions. Both the Yamanaka and the Akimichi had also supported Kakashi's promotion to Chunin when his qualifications had been called into question due to his young age, when it was obvious that he had the skills, and only his age was holding him back. Kakashi was saying that he didn't know about this. Well, of course he probably didn't, because otherwise he probably wouldn't be so wary of the clans. The better question was, why didn't he know? Kakashi hadn't spoken to the Yamanaka clan head, it seemed, and Inoichi would have to confirm that with his father later. "Well, we don't blame you in the least for what happened. Now, what was it that you wanted to talk about?" he questioned, getting back to the main reason he was there. While he would have liked to explain things further, he needed to speak with his father about some things. Kakashi fidgeted again. "Minato-sensei wanted me to talk about my nightmare, and how I keep crying," Kakashi mumbled. It was obvious to Inoichi that he was embarrassed by both of them. "We don't have to yet if you don't want to. You could just talk about you, maybe tell me about your team," he suggested. He figured that would be a good start since he'd learned what had happened with Obito. Originally he'd been planning to talk about Kakashi's ninken, which would have worked as well, but figured that he wouldn't learn much that he didn't already know about him, even if it would get the boy to relax some since he was so tense. Kakashi nodded in agreement, looking slightly relieved. Kakashi's POV. He'd thought that it would have been close to torture to deal with the future clan head, but it had just started out slightly uncomfortable, and he'd gotten used to the brunette's presence quickly. Inoichi didn't talk much after Kakashi got started, just prompted him onto another line of thought when he would run out of things to say on a particular subject. The only danger that he sensed was when he had to avoid talking about anything that hadn't happened yet. Thankfully most of the stuff had happened before his personality had changed, and he'd started to pay attention to at least Rin, after Obito had died. That meant that he had very little to remember, since he'd ignored them so much. "And I was wondering about what happened at practice 2 days ago," Inoichi stated offhandedly when Kakashi had run out of things to say about Obito. He tried to convey annoyance towards the Uchiha, and hoped that Inoichi bought it. Kakashi winced. "It wasn't really anything," he mumbled, shifting uncomfortably. Inoichi raised an eyebrow, and Kakashi inwardly sighed. That was the look that Ino had always given him when he wouldn't give her the full story about something she really wanted to know. Minato stated that it seemed to be the first time that Obito was actually meaning to attack you rather than just rile you up, Inoichi stated. Probably, Kakashi said in agreement. So can you tell me what exactly happened? If it makes you uncomfortable you can refuse, Inoichi tried. Sighing in resignation, and knowing that Inoichi would get it out of him eventually anyway, he nodded. It really wasn't much. We insult each other and argue all the time. Besides, it's not like he knew, Kakashi said before starting to explain what had happened. Flashback. Kakashi had once again arrived early to train, working on his chakra control once again since the training dummy still hadn't been replaced. He was getting a bit better but figured he would start on water walking as soon as he could. He supposed he could try the stream next to him, but since the water was moving quickly he might fall in and the water was starting to get cold at this time. He'd rather find still water and get up to par on that before he moved on to moving water, otherwise he'd have to cut his practice short to warm up, and it might cut into their team training. Kakashi-kun, good morning, Rin called as soon as he reached the base of the tree again. He turned and nodded in her direction. She soon reached him. How are you today? She asked him with a smile, but he could sense underlying worry. Had she seen him yesterday? He mentally slapped himself. Of course she had. The three ninken had been there the entire time, so logically she had been the one to send Minato to him. I'm fine. And you? He questioned politely, hoping that she wouldn't say anything about the day before. Thankfully she seemed to realize that it would make him uncomfortable to talk about, and didn't mention it. They spoke a bit about Yuhiai's training as they waited for the other two to arrive. When Obito had arrived half an hour after Minato, he had at first been wary about Kakashi suddenly being nice to Rin it seemed, but after that he must have figured it was all an act or something because he started his insults and attacks just as frequently as usual, even though Kakashi wasn't fight back this time. In truth, Kakashi was more than a little upset that things were starting off so poorly regarding Obito. Unfortunately his lack of attention seemed to just make Obito angrier, and as they were walking towards the ramen stand for a team lunch, he had made a comment that made all three of them pause. Obito-kun, Rin gasped, staring at the boy in shock. What did you just say? Minato demanded, though Kakashi was sure that he'd heard the Uchiha perfectly. For his part he was too shocked to know what to say. Obito had never been that cruel the first time around. The words seemed to echo in his mind as he stared at the glaring boy. Kakashi ignored Rin's worried glances and pushed past Minato, racing towards his home as fast as he could. You're lucky your parents are already dead, otherwise they would probably kill themselves, knowing they had someone like you for a son. And flashback. And I don't think he knew that my dad did kill himself, otherwise he probably wouldn't have said something. He was probably just trying to get a rise out of me since I was ignoring his other attempts to get me angry, Kakashi explained when he'd finished. He woke up Bull, who had started snoring on his lap. The puppy looked up at him and grumbled a bit before falling back asleep. And you weren't doing anything at all? Inoichi questioned. Kakashi lifted his head to look at the man. Not that I'm aware of. I could see him doing that if I was mocking him back, but I didn't say anything that he could have taken the wrong way. I don't think, Kakashi responded. Well, he'd been sort of ignoring the boy, but he figured it was better that than breaking down and getting locked up after he'd apologizing profusely and begged for forgiveness. After all, Minato wouldn't be able to brush that off. Inoichi's POV. He left shortly after allowing Kakashi to fill the remaining time talking about his ninken. It had been about 2 hours. For all, Kakashi hadn't really wanted to talk to him when everything had first started. He seemed to have a lot to say for someone who kept to himself most of the time. Inoichi wasn't adverse to listening or talking more, but he did have a shift in the TNI department that he had to get to. Thankfully they were in a time of peace, or he would be there all the time. He didn't care for torture and interrogation. He knew they were necessary, and that he was scarily good at them, but that didn't mean he liked them. Okay, so interrogation wasn't bad, but torture disgusted him. He'd gotten over it, but for the first several months he'd worked there he'd ended up throwing up after torturing someone, and sometimes he still did if it was bad enough. Kakashi had provided him with a lot of information, though he probably hadn't realized it. For one, there were some discrepancies in the way he spoke. Once or twice he'd used past tense in reference to his teammates, and the way he talked about them made it seem as though he'd known them personally for a lot longer than just the few short months that they had been a team. He was also pretty cautious about the way he spoke. Inoichi had thought at first he was just nervous, but as he continued to talk, it became apparent that he was analyzing everything before he said it, as if it might get him in trouble. Unlike how Minato had thought initially, from the way he spoke Kakashi actually did like his teammates. That had been part of the reason that he'd been so upset by Obito's words. Sure, he wouldn't have appreciated the reminder had he actually hated the Uchiha, but he would have brushed it off since the boy's opinion shouldn't have mattered that much. Also, he wouldn't have defended Obito. He was sort of confused as to why Kakashi tried to act as if he didn't like the Uchiha though. What didn't surprise him at all was how Kakashi could bond so well with his ninken. The Chunin saw them as his family. Inoichi had decided not to bring up Kakashi's nightmare, or his father this visit since the boy was still so tense around him, and there was something he wanted to check on. It would be a bit difficult to figure out because he couldn't give anything away about the details of his visit with Kakashi since they were confidential, but he knew that Shikaka wouldn't press him if he gave him barely any information about something. As for the eye problem that Minato had noticed, Inoichi had seen it a couple of times when Kakashi had lowered his guard a bit towards the end of the session. That he wasn't sure about, and for now he would suggest an eye doctor, but it did seem like it was actually something mental rather than physical. He paused in his walk when he saw a pug making his way towards the Hataki home. Packin' right?" he asked. The pug had been a common sight around Konoha when Kakashi had been on the clan's bad side, always walking alongside his silver-haired partner, and sometimes attacking people or dragging Kakashi away from the danger. Packin looked up and his ears flattened against his head a bit. "That's right. And you're a Yamanaka." "My pup better still be in one piece," he growled. Inoichi nodded. "He's fine." "I was actually wondering if you'd be willing to answer some questions," he replied. The pug's eyes narrowed. "If Kakashi won't tell you then I certainly won't," he snapped. Inoichi nodded. "I'm aware. These aren't really questions that I think Kakashi can answer though." "You can refuse if you want," he said. Packin nodded, still looking reluctant and suspicious of Inoichi's intentions. "All right, the first question. What exactly did Kakashi tell you happened with Inori?" he asked. Packin bared his teeth. "He didn't tell me anything. After you people started attacking him, he only talked to me about training. It took until you stopped attacking him once he graduated for him to even think about anything else but getting strong enough to protect himself," he growled. Inoichi had come to the conclusion that Kakashi had just figured that once he'd become a genin, attacking him would have resulted in fines towards Yamanaka clan, or even imprisonment, which was why they stopped. It fit perfectly with how Kakashi seemed to react to the clan, especially if he'd never had anything explained to him about the attacks. "Hey, finish your questions," Packin ordered, drawing him out of his thought. Inoichi nodded. "Sorry. Let's see, his nightmares. I figure he doesn't always wake up when he has them, so do you wake him up, or let him have them, and how many does he have on average each week?" Inoichi asked. While he didn't like being ordered around by the pug, he wanted his questions answered, and it wasn't like there wasn't a valid reason for Packin to dislike him. Packin tilted his head as he thought. "We don't always wake him up. Usually if one of us lies down with him then he'll calm down. We only wake him up if it seems really bad. It kind of depends on average. He had a couple of years where it was only every couple of months. He's been having them every night for the past week though, and these ones are really bad so we have to wake him up. We haven't been able to for the last 2 days, since he's got Shiba shut in the room with him. We heard him though," he explained, obviously not seeing anything wrong with the question. Inoichi nodded. "Well, if you think of anything else that you think might help I'd be interested. Other than that I'll be returning in 2 days, he said in farewell and left. Obito's POV. He kicked at the training dummy on his property, breathing harshly as he got more and more angry. Minato had ordered him home for the next 5 days, the same amount of time Kakashi was getting off. He'd been informed that if he didn't apologize to Kakashi then he would be kicked off the team for a longer period of time. This wasn't his fault, Kakashi always insulted him too, but Obito didn't see him getting kicked off the team. Besides, it wasn't like he expected his insult to actually upset Kakashi. The boy was practically a robot. In addition, Obito knew that Packin was Kakashi's ninken. He'd put 2 and 2 together after Minato had said Kakashi wasn't going to be at training so he could work with his new ninken. While he'd been healed perfectly at the hospital and insisted he'd felt fine, Minato had told him he should take the day off since healing took a lot out of the body and training wasn't recommended right after such a procedure. He missed a day of training and doing a mission with Rin. As far as he was concerned, Minato was babying Kakashi since he liked him better. He'd known Kakashi for longer and naturally cared more for him than he did for Rin and Obito. Otherwise he should have kicked Kakashi off the team for whenever Kakashi had insulted him, since most of his insults ended up upsetting the Uchiha. He'd known since he'd been placed on the team that Kakashi would always be Minato's favorite though. The man was still refusing to give them a C rank even though the others that graduated at the same time had already been on multiple C ranks, and even several B rank. His excuse was that they weren't acting like a team, but that was all Kakashi's fault too. He slowly stopped striking the training dummy and moved over to sit down on the nearby log. He had a pretty big training ground and yard, even a house to himself. It wasn't really a reward or anything though. The house was pretty much falling down, and the yard was overrun with dead plants and trees. This was called the annex, which was actually walled off from the rest of the Uchiha compound. He was the first person to live here in the past 20 years. It was punishment for doing so horribly and upholding the Uchiha name. Damn bastard, he muttered about Kakashi. Minato had told him that he needed to talk to Kakashi if he wanted to figure out how exactly he'd upset his Chunin teammates, so right now Obito had nothing to do but train on his own and think, since there was no way he was going to talk to Kakashi. The more thinking he did, the angrier he got. He'd thought Minato had understood how much he liked Rin, so he should have realized that Obito was upset at how that day had been going. First he arrived to see Rin and Kakashi acting all friendly. Then he'd learned that Rin had been over at his house the day before. Added to that, Kakashi was ignoring him. Obito had called him a bastard when he'd arrived and Rin had gently reprimanded him, but Kakashi hadn't even given any indication that he'd heard. The rest of the day had been pretty much Kakashi ignoring him, but paying almost too much attention to Rin as they worked. Finally he'd gotten angry and he may have been a little out of line, but Kakashi already had Rin's affection. Had he wanted to, Kakashi could have gotten a date with her, and Obito had been interested in her first. Not even that, Kakashi had been a complete jerk to her in the past, and Obito had been nothing but nice. Kakashi definitely didn't deserve Rin's affection or attention. After he'd had time to cool down, he'd admitted to himself that he had said what he'd out of jealousy. But that didn't mean that he was any more out of line than Kakashi had ever been. He didn't think it was fair to be forced to apologize to the Hotaki when the other boy wasn't going to be apologizing to him. Rin's POV. 4 days had passed since the last mission they'd taken, and Kakashi had raced off. Obito had brushed it off as Kakashi just trying to get attention, but Rin had seen how upset the comment had made him. Unlike Obito, she knew exactly how much a comment like that would have hurt the Chunin. Sure, it would have hurt less had Kakashi's father not actually killed himself, but it was still highly inappropriate and cruel of the Uchiha, regardless of the circumstances. She was a bit confused as well, not expecting something like that from him since he was usually so sweet to her, and at least always insulting Kakashi in self-defense rather than trying to antagonize him. Minato had requested that she let Kakashi have time to cool down, but she figured that 4 days was enough time and really wanted to make sure he was alright. That was how she found herself tentatively knocking on his door around 10 the next morning. It took a little while, but soon he answered. Her eyes immediately widened. "What happened to your arm?" she cried out. Kakashi immediately gestured for her to be quieter. "Sure, it was just one of the puppies, he hasn't learned not to bite yet, it's fine," he told her, stepping back to let her in, throwing glances over his shoulder distractedly. "He's fine pup," Pakken told him, walking out from the hallway. "Oh, hello Rin-chan," he greeted when he spotted her. Rin gave him a strained smile back as she stepped inside. "Hello Pakken," she said, before turning back to Kakashi. "Even if they aren't too bad, have you at least cleaned them?" "Saliva carries a lot of bacteria and it could get infected," she stressed. Kakashi nodded. "It's fine, I've cleaned them really well." "Now please lower your voice a little, Shiba has sensitive hearing and I just got him calmed down," he requested. Rin sighed, but nodded in agreement, deciding to change the subject. "Kakashi-kun, I just wanted to know if you were alright after what Obito said," she told him hesitantly. Kakashi frowned, moving to pick up the dark brown puppy that had flopped to the ground, having tripped over its huge paws. "I'm fine. I figured it was retaliation for all the stuff I've said to him in the past," he responded with a shrug. Her frown deepened. That wasn't right. Kakashi shouldn't be brushing off something like this. Even if she hadn't been able to read his expression very well at the time, he wouldn't have run off like that had he not at least been somewhat affected by Obito's words. "I know what happened to your father," she said tentatively. Kakashi just shrugged. "A lot of people know what happened to my father." "I'm sure Obito didn't though," he pointed out. Once again Rin was surprised. Kakashi seemed to be defending the Uchiha. "Now if that's all, I need to take Bull to Inuzuka-san for his checkup," Kakashi told her, lifting up the dog in his arms, which barked happily at her. She smiled at him. "Don't you have two?" she asked. Kakashi nodded. "I can't take them at the same time, so him first, Shiba in a few days when he's calmer," he told her. She nodded. "Well, I'll walk with you and we can talk on the way," she decided. Rin hoped she wasn't being too forceful, but thankfully Kakashi just nodded in agreement. On the way there they didn't do too much talking about what had happened, much to Rin's disappointment. Instead, Kakashi had steered the conversation towards how her one-on-one training with their sensei was going. She noticed that he wasn't very comfortable talking about Obito with her though, so she didn't put up too much of a fuss. "Hey brat, get yourself a girlfriend?" A loud woman's voice interrupted them. Rin blushed heavily at her words and Kakashi rolled his eyes. "This is my teammate Noira Rin," he introduced to the woman that was moving towards them. "Rin, this is Inuzuka-tsum." It appeared as though they had arrived at their destination. Rin immediately bowed. She'd heard of Tsum. The woman was next in line for the position of clan head. Usually it would be a male heir in most clans, but in the Inuzuka clan it was the one who was the most skilled, and that was definitely Tsum. "Very pleased to meet you Inuzuka-san," Rin greeted. A bark of laughter made her look up. "You're quite the polite one. It's just some kid," she laughed before turning to Kakashi. She'd also heard that the Inuzuka were an informal clan, but also that they despised formalities altogether in most cases. That was why she hadn't called Tsum Inuzuka-sama. It seemed that Tsum still thought it was a bit too much. "Well, bring Bull inside, I'll give him his checkup," she told him and looked over at Rin. "You should probably head home. You'll see your boyfriend at training later," she said with a grin. Rin colored once again. She wasn't used to people teasing her like this, and from a clan heir it wasn't really expected. "I'll see you later Kakashi-kun," she mumbled before racing back in the direction they had come from. Tsum's POV. She grinned as the girl took off. She had been pretty fun to tease. Turning back, she saw Kakashi looking at her with a slightly annoyed expression and her grin widened. "Well, come on inside brat. We'll get your puppy looked at," she told him cheerfully, opening the door and heading inside. Tsum had always had a soft spot for Kakashi. She hadn't known Tsukumo at all, but like almost everyone, she knew what he had done. In her opinion, even though it hadn't been popular opinion at the time, he had been completely right to do as he had done on that mission. While ninja were trained to follow the shinobi code, most of them didn't work with ninken. A ninken wasn't just another weapon, they were a partner, and an extension of a ninja. Had Kuramaru been the one in danger, she would have saved him, consequences be damned, and that was how she felt a team should function. So when Minato had approached the Inuzuka clan about finding Kakashi a puppy that he might be able to train as a ninken, she had volunteered. Of course, she wasn't able to take a puppy from their kennels since they were specially bred and Kakashi wasn't part of their clan, so she had taken quite a bit of time searching through the animal shelter for him. Pakken had been the best pick from all the litters there. While he was small, she had figured he would be a pretty good companion. She had been right. Pakken had learned human speech nearly 4 times faster than any of the Inuzuka ninken had, and most of them actually never learned. Her choices of Urushi and Yuhei had been excellent as well. Urushi was a bit behind Pakken in speech, but was better at scenting. Yuhei was pretty hyper, but as far as both sight and scenting were concerned, he was great. The first time she had met Kakashi, her first thought had been that the boy was a horrible brat. She had nearly taken the pug back to the shelter because of how he had behaved, but Minato had requested that she leave the dog on a trial basis, and he would return the puppy himself if Kakashi was unable to care for him. That had definitely been the right decision because soon Kakashi was visiting her house every couple of days for advice on how to better care for and train Pakken. The initial impression had most likely been due to the pain of losing his father. On Kakashi's 10th birthday, she had closed down the store to help him pick out the 2 new additions to his family, and actually found herself wondering why she needed to be there at all. Kakashi seemed to know exactly what to look for and made his choices easily. While Shiba was a mutt with no papers, he was healthy and once he calmed down he would aid the team by detecting sounds. She'd been surprised that Kakashi had picked up on something like that, but he'd immediately picked up the dog and carried it out, telling her that the puppy would be alright once they were away from the noise. He shouldn't have been able to make such an observation with his limited interactions with dogs outside of his 3. With Bull, he had been the only one of his litter that had been taken to the shelter, and the papers showed him to be a slight mix, but predominantly Irish Mastiff. He was a very good choice for Kakashi's team, and would start showing that once he was able to walk without tripping over his own paws every few steps. Kakashi's other ninken were smaller and better suited for tracking, but Bull would be a good enforcer since he would grow so large. Judging from his paw size, he would soon be bigger than Kakashi. Kakashi would have to do a lot of growing to catch up. His temperament wasn't completely desirable, how friendly he was with everyone, but he would grow out of that as his training progressed because otherwise it would be dangerous on missions if he suddenly tried to befriend an enemy ninja. Take him out and we'll get him looked at, she told Kakashi, getting started. Minato's POV. He exchanged worried glances with Rin as the 3 sat at the training grounds, all of them attempting to ignore the tense atmosphere. Kakashi's last day of leave had ended, and he had returned for training that day. The question that they all had on their minds was whether or not Obito would show up as well. Minato had met with the Uchiha the day before and told him not to bother to return to training if he wasn't planning on apologizing to Kakashi, and Obito had still maintained that he hadn't done anything wrong. He insisted that everything was Kakashi's fault, and didn't see why he had to be the one to apologize. The 3 had already waited longer than the normal amount of time they usually had to for the Uchiha to arrive, and it seemed he had made his decision. Minato finally sighed in resignation and rose to his feet. Rin, Kakashi, I got you some more missions weeding gardens, so we should head over to the first one, he told them. Rin hesitated, but finally nodded. He could tell from her expression how much this was upsetting her. Even though she sided with Kakashi most of the time, she had been friends with Obito since the academy, and just wanted the 2 to put aside their differences and become friends, or at the very least not hate each other. Kakashi just nodded at Minato and stood up as well. The Hatake hadn't spoken much except to exchange greetings with them, and Minato was half suspecting that Kakashi was as anxious about what Obito would decide to do as they were, while a couple weeks before he would have said that Kakashi didn't care. Today he noticed how Kakashi would glance in the direction that Obito usually came from, probably when he figured nobody was looking at him. He had been surprised when he'd stopped by to visit the Hatake, and the boy had requested that Minato allow Obito back on the team without an apology, but he couldn't really do that. Even if Kakashi wasn't upset with him, he had definitely gone too far with his words and needed to realize that what he said was not okay and would not be tolerated. So, unlike the last time they'd had this type of mission, Kakashi ignored Rin's attempts at conversation. At first Minato had been worried that Kakashi was starting to pull away from his teammate again, but judging by his expression as he worked, he was thinking pretty hard about something and wasn't purposefully being rude to her. Rin understood. Of course she did. She was very good at reading her masked teammate, and didn't become upset when he brushed her off. Kakashi's POV. He had hoped that Obito would show up to training. It wasn't for an apology, at least, not the apology Rin and Minato were expecting. Kakashi wanted to apologize to him. True, he wasn't exactly sure what he'd done to piss off Obito at their last meeting, but hoped that apologizing for that, and then working his way back to the things he'd done in the past might help clear things up enough between them that Obito didn't completely hate him. Unfortunately, it seemed that wasn't going to be happening for a little while. He'd attempted to talk to Obito the day before, making his way over to the Uchiha compound. The people at the entrance hadn't even listened to his reasons after he'd asked for Obito before turning him away, and had refused to deliver a message of any kind. He'd thought about asking Minato for help in contacting him, but the blonde hadn't listened when Kakashi had said he didn't want an apology, and Kakashi wasn't sure he would help. Thinking back, he may have screwed things up even more. The first time around he had been kicked off the team, which had been the first point in time when Minato had taken Obito's side instead of Kakashi's. Because he changed things, even the smallest bit, now Minato was once again siding against Obito. When he'd been a kid he thought that insulting his teammate was perfectly acceptable, considering his opinion of the Uchiha back then. That was why he'd never actually apologized for what he'd said to Obito in the instance when he'd been removed from the team. He hadn't thought he'd been wrong to say what he had said, much like Obito now. The major difference, though, was that Minato was once again ignoring every time he made Obito cry, in favor of punishing Obito for the one time he'd upset Kakashi. The last time around Minato hadn't really known how to deal with the three of them. Sure, he knew how to handle Kakashi to an extent since he had looked after him for so long, but Kakashi hadn't been a normal kid by any stretch of the imagination. While teamwork was something that Minato thought was important, he also was a lot closer to Kakashi than the other two, and was prone to letting things he did slide. This had some negative effects, a major one being that Obito had started to resent both Kakashi and Minato. While Kakashi didn't remember seeing any signs that Obito felt this way, he had been pretty dismissive of the Uchiha. The last time they'd all been together though, he'd seen how Obito had acted around their sensei, and could tell that he was pretty much resigned to being considered second best. That was likely true once again now that Minato had stepped in to defend Kakashi. This time he hoped to push Minato to look at them more equally rather than looking after Kakashi specifically since he'd taken care of him and known him for so long. True, Minato had eventually figured things out from what Kakashi could tell, reprimanding both of them for their insults and arguments. But it had taken him so long that the rift between Kakashi and Obito had grown very large. Kakashi was pretty sure that at the time it would have been impossible to repair. Of course, when Kakashi had disregarded the mission orders so that he could help out Obito and Rin, there was a chance that Obito would have forgiven him had they not been separated directly after. For all of the things Kakashi could see wrong with how Minato approached the situation though, he definitely didn't blame the man for anything. He was trying his best, especially since he'd taken in Kakashi when he'd only been in his mid-teens, and was still a teenager at this time. No, none of this would have been happening now, or would have happened in the future, had he not rejected his teammates as soon as he'd met them, and continued to dismiss them all the way up until just before Obito's supposed death. He was sorry about ignoring Rin as they worked on their missions that day, but he had a lot of thinking to do and hoped that he would be able to run into Obito soon to talk with him, as well as discuss things with Minato. When Minato had told them that it was time for their missions, Kakashi had wanted to request that they wait for a little while longer, but he knew that there was no way Obito would be showing up now. He had never been more than just over an hour late. It seemed that Rin and Minato were just as hopeful as Kakashi was though. There seemed to have been an unspoken agreement after the first hour had passed, that they would wait one more. That day they had received 2 missions, and that was a rare number for just a team of 2 to take even in a week since paying for a D-rank mission cost the same amount no matter how many genin worked on it, so people would request full teams to get their money's worth. Although, the type of work that they were doing now did show that Minato hadn't expected Obito to show up since he'd chosen missions that could be taken by just the 2 before he'd even met them at the training grounds. They finished up the second one around noon. How about we go out for barbecue? Minato suggested as they left the Hokage Tower after collecting their pay. Kakashi could tell he was looking to cheer him up, and would have felt more grateful had he felt that he actually deserved to be cheered up. Okay, Rin readily agreed. Kakashi hesitated before shaking his head. Sorry, sensei. Maybe some other time, he told him reluctantly. Minato just gave him a small smile and ruffled his hair. It's fine, Kakashi, go home and check on your ninken, he said. That wasn't the reason that Kakashi wanted to leave, but he took the excuse and nodded. While he would have liked to talk with Minato right then about everything, he didn't want Rin to get involved. He figured it might embarrass the man since he was supposed to be the responsible adult, so he figured that they should discuss things in private. As soon as Rin and Minato had entered the establishment, he headed towards his house. First he figured he would check on his ninken since he would have to soon anyway, but then he wanted to try and find Obito again. It wasn't like Obito would hole himself up in the Uchiha compound all day after all. He had just finished playing with Shiba and closed him into his room again, when he heard knocking at his front door. He winced as he realized that he had agreed to meet with the Yamanaka today around 1. With all the tension surrounding the wait for Obito, it had slipped his mind. Thankfully the missions had been short, and he'd been released early, otherwise he would have completely skipped the session. Kakashi answered the door quickly. Yamanaka-san, he greeted as he had done the previous time. I already told you, Inoichi is fine. And I figured that we could talk outside this time if you were alright with that, the blonde suggested. Kakashi frowned. He wanted to go talk to Obito as soon as he could to smooth things over. It wouldn't be a good idea to cancel this session with Inoichi though. Even if Inoichi said that he was alright with him, canceling on a clan heir was really bad form, and he supposed that meeting with Obito could wait a little. He wasn't even sure if he could find him after all. Where? He finally asked. Inoichi shrugged. I'm leaving that up to you, he replied. Inoichi's POV. He could tell that Kakashi was debating with himself about attending the session, and he wondered if Kakashi had talked himself out of continuing counseling. That would be bad, especially with what he'd found out from his father and Shikaku since he'd last spoken with the two. Had Kakashi cancelled, then Inoichi would have insisted that Minato force the boy to speak with him, or at least someone else if he was uncomfortable for any reason. Thankfully, Kakashi seemed to have talked himself into speaking with Inoichi, and when he was given the option of deciding where to go, he chose the Hokage monument. After saying goodbye to his ninken, Kakashi locked the door and they started on their way. As they walked, Inoichi thought, the things he had learned since they had last met would have to wait until after this session, at least. He needed to get a better read on Kakashi's mental state first and more proof, because otherwise he doubted Kakashi would be able to handle this revelation on top of everything else that he was dealing with. He would probably also deny everything that he was told. While what Inoichi had found had the potential to be very dangerous if it was left unchecked, bringing it up now could cause more damage. Flashback Inoichi's POV. Inoichi, I've spoken with Terasan, and he's stated that you're advancing through the ranks quickly, his father stated when he entered the house instead of a normal greeting. That was probably as close to praise as Inoichi was going to get from the man. Yamanaka Inahiko was the current clan head and former head of the torture and interrogation department. He would have gladly remained there, but his methods were considered too brutal and he'd ended up breaking the minds of, or killing, several of the prisoners that they needed to extract information from. He was basically the exact opposite of Inoichi in this respect. Interrogation definitely wasn't his strong point. He lacked the patience to interrogate someone and generally ended up moving on to torture immediately if he couldn't get the information he wanted right away. The Hokage had ordered him removed from the position, and while he was still a konoha jounin, he wasn't generally on active duty and remained home most of the time. Of course, if the village was in danger or a war started, Inoichi's father would be reinstated because they would need all the help they could get. Yes, that's correct. I had a question for you about the memory manipulation technique, he stated bluntly. Had he skirted the subject, his father would have gotten irritated with him. Inahiko raised an eyebrow. And? He prompted impatiently when Inoichi didn't continue. If you don't have a specific memory in mind and are intending to change that memory, then what exactly would the effects be? He questioned. Inahiko frowned. You haven't done anything stupid, have you, boy? He demanded. Inoichi shook his head quickly. I was just curious, he replied hurriedly. While it was a technique in his family arsenal, it hadn't been one that he had focused on when he'd been in the field because it took a great deal of time and chakra to succeed with. It also wasn't as necessary for him as most of the others he'd learned. While he had looked through the scroll, the answers to any of the questions he had were either vague, or required experience with the technique to be answered. Otherwise he wouldn't bring this up to his father. The fewer people involved in this the better. At least that's how Kakashi would see it anyway. Inahiko sank back into his seat. Although from his expression he was less than satisfied with Inoichi's answer, it seemed that he would let it slide for now. Well, provided you have the skills not to shatter that person's mind, you might be able to look through their memories a bit. Or you'll end up moving memories around, erasing some, pulling some to the front of the mind so that it's something that the victim will be thinking about. Why? He questioned. Maybe he wouldn't let this go fully. Inoichi could see that the man was trying to read him. While reading expressions was more useful in interrogations and Inahiko found it to be more of an annoyance to try, he would use it when he had to, especially since he actually cared for his son enough not to employ harsher methods in order to learn things from him. Inoichi shook his head again. No reason. I just saw Hatake Kakashi earlier today and was thinking about what Inori tried to do. And then I was wondering about the false memories that you could theoretically create if you were able to successfully use the technique, he stated. Inahiko cursed under his breath. While Inoichi didn't like how much his father enjoyed torture, he admired how loyal he was to the village. The mention of Inoichi's cousin was generally a pretty easy way to piss him off considering the fact that Kakashi was an ally. The main thing that upset the man was that Inori was still a ninja. Inoichi's aunt had argued fiercely when Inahiko had wanted Inori to be removed from the program and become a civilian. Inoichi had been in agreement with his aunt that he was being overly harsh with that punishment, since she was just a 6-year-old kid that didn't know any better. His father had finally relented when his sister suggested an alternative punishment for the girl that he liked. Besides, it had partially been his fault, which he grudgingly admitted. Inori had somehow gotten a hold of the technique scroll to learn it, and the scrolls were watched over by Inahiko. Inahiko was eyeing him suspiciously again. You could either put in a memory of your design, but you'd have to throw in details to make the victim believe that they were true memories. Or you could shift an existing memory to make the victim believe the events were slightly different. That method is easier since you don't have to use as much chakra or put as much planning into it, he explained, and Inoichi was sure that he was trying to determine whether or not Inoichi was considering using these on someone. While it was alright with him if his son used such a technique on an enemy nin, he was probably suspicious about whether or not that was the reason he was asking questions since Inoichi wasn't outright telling him his intentions. Once again, Inoichi couldn't say anything since he didn't want anything pointing to Kakashi. Thankfully, he only had one more question. How can you detect or remove one of these false memories? He wondered. Even though Inoichi could see that his father now knew exactly what he was getting at, the man didn't comment, thankfully. It seemed like he'd caught his father in one of his rare good moods. The same way you change them. Start the technique like you're meaning to change the memory. If it's false, then you'll be able to influence it without chakra, like you're in someone's dream and can see things outside a first person. If it's real, then it won't move. Removing it just takes a push with your chakra, he responded. Inoichi nodded in understanding. Thanks, he said and left the room, ignoring his father's orders to tell him why he was asking all of those questions as his patience finally ran out. Inoichi shook his head in exasperation as he walked away, knowing that even if he said that he was protecting a client's privacy, his father would want to know anyway. This had supported his suspicions from earlier though. Coupled with what Minato had told him about Kakashi's nightmare, and the meager amount of information surrounding Tsukumo's death, Inoichi was starting to think he was right. And flashback. Kakashi's nightmares, along with the emotional outbursts, were what had made him start to draw the conclusion. Inori had said that she wasn't able to finish her technique, and the fact that Kakashi could still function had led them to conclude that she was telling the truth and had failed. However, Kakashi couldn't fully remember what had happened at the time, why he had ended up attacking Inori. That had started him thinking that maybe Inori's technique had succeeded partially, and by some miracle she hadn't done much damage before Kakashi had been able to stop her. After he'd spoken with his teammate Shikaku, he suspected that Inori had inadvertently uncovered previous memory tampering that nobody had ever even considered because it was so unlikely. Using any sort of memory-altering technique on anyone under about the age of 10 was dangerous, and at 5 or even younger it was unheard of because of the ramifications as the child developed. The walk wasn't too long, and Kakashi kept either just a little behind him, or right at his side, obviously to keep the blonde in his sights. While Inoichi didn't like the situation, having also been trained to expect an attack if you weren't able to fully see people that were close by, he allowed it for now since he doubted the Hatake would attack him. Kakashi's situation was strange. Inoichi's volunteer jobs were taken because someone specifically wanted to talk to him. This was the only case that his client had been rather reluctant to hold a conversation. It was different because usually his patients talked a great deal since they'd actively sought him out rather than being referred by someone. Kakashi only spoke when prompted, and wasn't as forthcoming about why exactly he was talking to Inoichi in the first place. When they reached the top of the monument, Kakashi sat down on the base of the cliff just above the faces. Inoichi sat down nearby. This conversation went about the same as the last one, most likely because even though Kakashi seemed to trust him a bit more, he didn't have his ninken with him for moral support this time. Getting him to talk about his nightmare had taken a little while, but finally Kakashi reluctantly explained what had happened. It had been a bit more detailed than what Minato had told him, most likely because Minato hadn't wanted to lose Kakashi's trust if he told too much. He brought up Kakashi's eye this time as well, if only because even though it still didn't look like it hurt him, he was closing it just as frequently as he had before. Kakashi had assured him that he was fine, and had made an effort to keep it open as much as his other eye, even though he failed. Since he wasn't listening to Inoichi's advice though, he would have to talk to Minato about taking him to a doctor to get it checked out. This time Inoichi didn't get to talk to him more than half an hour before a hawk had descended, landing in front of him, and holding out its leg with a letter attached. Sorry Kakashi. It looks like we're cutting things short, he apologized after he'd removed the letter and had quickly glanced over it. It was insisting that he head to the Hokage Tower immediately. Kakashi frowned in response but shrugged. That's alright. I should probably start looking for Obito, he responded, earning a raised brow in response. He shrugged again. He skipped training so we couldn't talk about what happened, so I figured I'd track him down, he explained. Inoichi just nodded in response, having expected that sort of thing. After bidding the Hatake farewell, he swiftly left to reach the tower, entering the Hokage's office after the secretary had admitted him. He frowned. Shikaku was there as well, leaning up against the wall. Good. You made it, the third said before offering the seat in front of his desk. May I ask what this is about, Hokage-sama? He questioned as he sat down. His missions all took place inside the village now, as of last year. Shikaku was currently looking over village security measures, so he was pretty much off active duty at this time too. The third responded by placing a file in front of him, one that Inoichi had seen just a couple of days before. Is there a problem, Hokage-sama? He asked. The third chewed on his pipe for a moment before answering. Not really. I just had some questions about why two of my top jounin were looking into an almost 6-year-old closed case when they should be much too busy to have that sort of free time, he responded. He wasn't reprimanding them for not doing their work though. He seemed genuinely curious about what the two had found that they deemed so important that they would sacrifice some of their already limited free time. Because we think the investigators were biased idiots who didn't do their work correctly, Shikaku replied lazily. Inoichi winced. Shikaku was too blunt sometimes. Be careful what you say, Shikaku. As Inoichi suspected, the Hokage didn't let him get away with blaming his comrades for anything. Shikaku shrugged. Sorry, Hokage-sama. If you wish, I can call them incompetent so it doesn't look like I'm accusing them of something, he offered. Inoichi wanted to bang his head against the desk at that, but he was sure the Hokage wouldn't want his paperwork disturbed. Of course, Shikaku knew he could get away with saying these things in the man's presence, receiving nothing more than a slight reprimand, or he wouldn't have even considered it. Thankfully, the Hokage didn't enable him more and just rolled his eyes. And what makes you think their conclusion is wrong? He asked instead of scolding the man again, probably trying to get back to the matter at hand before Shikaku ended up making him look like an idiot. His friend didn't mean to do so, but it seemed that was the inevitable if someone entered a conversation with him about anything but the weather, and even then there was no guarantee. Shikaku sighed. It's all there in the report, he stated lazily, before elaborating. Flashback Inoichi's POV. After getting a copy of the thin report from the investigation of Tsukumo's death, he made his way over to the Nara property. Thankfully the deer were alright with him since Shikaku had introduced him as a friend, so he was able to reach his teammates' home unhindered. Though, he was escorted there since he wasn't fully trusted. At this time Shikaku lived in an apartment near the main house. His mother was the current clan head and lived in the main house with his father and sister. He'd moved out as soon as he could, something about having an overbearing mother. As the era would soon be his home in the future, though not until after his mother either passed the position on to him willingly, or died. Inoichi doubted Nara Shikata, Shikaku's mother, would allow Shikaku to take over as long as she was alive though. In her opinion he was too lazy, and even if he never said it aloud, Inoichi agreed with her completely. Inoichi didn't particularly like asking Shikaku for help because he usually always made Inoichi feel like an idiot with the way he made it seem as though everything he explained was common sense. He was quickly admitted into the house after knocking, and soon was sitting on the couch nearby Shikaku, who was slouching as he leaned against the wall. Even though he prided himself on being able to understand human behavior, Inoichi doubted he would ever get why his friend preferred to stand rather than sit in the company of others, especially since he was so laid back. So? Shikaku asked after looking over the file lazily, tossing it onto the coffee table in front of Inoichi. So I was wondering what you thought about it. It was pretty small compared to the other files and seemed sort of disorganized and sloppy, he explained. Shikaku rolled his eyes. Of course it's small and sloppy. They didn't do half the investigation work they needed to and came up with the wrong conclusion. He sighed and shook his head in slight exasperation. Wrong conclusion? Inoichi asked in confusion. It wasn't a suicide then? Shikaku snorted, open to the first page. It states that the door to the office was closed when the kid's babysitter got there. For one, why would the kid close the door after finding his father's body? For another, that door should have been impossible for her to get through since it was enforced from the outside by seals created by Jiraiya, and it took a while for Minato to deactivate it hours later since they wanted to close the door and not get locked out. The brat's babysitter was just a chunin at the time, and her focus was on taijutsu. She didn't have any skills related to seals, he explained. Inoichi nodded in understanding. Then why didn't the people making the report catch this? He asked. Shikaku raised an eyebrow, and Inoichi immediately felt really stupid. Hatake Tsukumo was hated by most of Konoha, and judging by this report, the people investigating disliked him. They didn't think solving this was important, so they just threw something together after collecting the minimum amount of information that they could, and then presented it as fact. So you can tell that to the kid, he said. Inoichi winced when his teammate revealed that he knew Inoichi's intentions. Shikaku waved it off. Don't worry about it. I won't say anything. Just, if you do get the case reopened, then I'll be interested in knowing what exactly you find out. Since both the babysitter and the brat didn't contest the results, he requested lazily. And flashback. The third frown, looking over the information that Shikaku was pointing out. Inoichi could see that he was pretty much convinced at this point. The third trusted Shikaku's judgment in pretty much all situations, and this time was no different even if Shikaku was pretty condescending about it. The Hokage had been busy at the time of Tsukumo's death and had just accepted the investigators' final decision without looking through their work, but now he definitely could see that something was off. Does Kakashi-kun know? He finally asked. Not yet, and it would be best not to tell him until we get more information, if we can continue the investigation, that is. I figured I would bring Minato-san in soon though, Inoichi replied. The old man nodded. That's fine, and I'm curious as well. I'll speak with my ANBU that looked into this myself, he offered with a slightly angry tone, making Inoichi glad that he wasn't the one that the third was mad at. Despite his age, this man was one of the strongest ninja in the village, if not the strongest, and if someone was on his bad side, it would not end well for them. Kakashi's POV. As soon as Inoichi had left, Kakashi summoned Pakken. While he didn't really want to expose Obito to the pug again, he was the only one of the ninken that currently knew Obito's scent and would have to do. Hey pup. That was quick, Pakken said with a frown when he appeared, immediately looking around for the blonde that Kakashi was supposed to have been with. He got a message from the Hokage, so he had to leave. I was wondering if you'd be willing to find Obito for me, he informed the dog. Pakken huffed in annoyance at the task he'd been set. I can if you want me to, he grudgingly responded. Kakashi hoped he'd get over his dislike for the Uchiha. A moment later Pakken was heading for the stairs. This way, he said, turning back when Kakashi didn't immediately follow. Kakashi quickly caught up with him, and soon they were on their way through the village. It seemed Obito had spent a lot of time in the marketplace today because Pakken tracked his scent through several places before moving on to the training grounds. Surprisingly, Obito was sitting on the bridge next to their training grounds, swinging his legs and staring down into the water. He looked up as soon as he sensed Kakashi along with Pakken. His expression hardened as he rose to his feet. Hey bastard, Obito shouted, moving towards him. He stopped right in front of him, glaring. This is all your fault, you know, he continued before Kakashi could say anything. Why does sensei always side with you? You aren't even that great. All you do is show off and insult us. Obito continued to rant for the next several minutes, and Kakashi just stood there silently, listening to all of the problems the Uchiha had with him, and it seemed like there were a fair few. A couple of them Kakashi could see were just silly though, like that he had gravity-defying hair, and that it was gray and made him look old. Obito's POV. He finally stopped to catch his breath as Kakashi and Pakken stared at him. Thankfully, he had been able to get out everything that he wanted to say without any interruptions from his teammate. He'd been about to start yelling again in case his teammate had missed something, when Kakashi spoke, making him pause in surprise. What? He stuttered out. He hadn't been expecting something like that. I'm sorry, Kakashi repeated simply. Well, there went the rest of his rant. You're sorry? Obito asked incredulously. Kakashi nodded. That's what I said. I haven't been fair to you or Rin since you've joined the team, and for that I'm sorry, he clarified. Obito's surprise turned to suspicion. Wait, you aren't just saying that, right? He asked. Actually, considering he just said it. Pakken was cut off by a warning look from Kakashi. Be nice, and no, I mean it. Really. And you don't have to apologize to me for anything. I've said some pretty nasty things to you in the past too, and a lot more than just once, he offered. Obito continued to stare at him for a while, trying to gauge if he was being sincere or not. It would have been a lot easier had he not been wearing the mask. That had been one of his complaints as well. But finally he decided to give Kakashi the benefit of the doubt, at least this once. That didn't mean that they would suddenly be best friends though. There was just one more thing he had to clarify. So, are you interested in Rin? He asked suspiciously. Kakashi frowned in response. Of course not. I thought you were? He replied. Obito's eyes widened. Even Kakashi was able to tell? Sure, he was sort of obvious, and Rin should have realized that too, but for Kakashi of all people to notice something that he never outright stated, at least in regard to feelings, was a huge surprise. What? He yelped. Don't worry, I won't tell her, she'll realize it eventually. I guess some people can just be dense about other people's feelings towards them, Kakashi assured him wisely, apparently misinterpreting Obito's confusion. On the one hand, Obito wanted to yell at Kakashi for calling Rin dense. On the other, I don't want to hear something like that from you of all people, he cried. Kakashi stared at him in confusion at the outburst. What? He asked. Obito sighed. Never mind, he told him before turning his attention to the pug. What about telling that thing to attack me? He demanded, anger flaring up once again. Who are you calling a thing? Pakken demanded as he tried to climb higher onto Kakashi's shoulder. This is Pakken, and I didn't tell him to do anything, Kakashi introduced as the two glared daggers at each other. Obito continued to glare at the pug until Kakashi gave the dog a little nudge. It looked over at the silver-haired boy and frowned. Why pup? I don't want to, he argued against Kakashi's unspoken command. Pakken, he said warningly. You can't make me, he growled. I won't buy floral green shampoo anymore, Kakashi threatened. The pug's eyes widened. You fiend, my coat won't be as lustrous if you don't, he said in horror. Had Obito not been really confused, he might have started laughing at the conversation his teammate and the dog were having. The ninken glowered at his partner for almost another full minute before he reluctantly turned to Obito. I'm sorry for being so rough on you at training, Pakken grudgingly apologized. Though Obito severely doubted the validity of the apology, he figured it was as good as he was going to get, but that didn't mean he accepted it. Apparently Kakashi agreed that that was as much as the pug was going to cooperate because he maneuvered until he was able to set the dog on the ground. How about you head home and I'll see you later, Kakashi suggested to him. Pakken looked at him sternly. Be careful, pup, he ordered, throwing another glare at Obito before taking off. The two watched him leave before he heard Kakashi sigh and turn back to his teammate. I figured you should at least know why Sensei reacted the way he did to what you said. He moved over to the tree and sat down at the base, usually Rin's spot. Obito frowned, but followed and sat down on the grass a short ways away. He was a bit curious as to why Minato had reacted so badly to what he'd said. Kakashi shifted uncomfortably and stared at his hands as he started out. You're right, I am an orphan. My mom died when I was really little. I probably only remember what she looks like because of pictures. My dad, though, he raised me after my mom died. Even though he had a lot of missions at the time, he did the best he could. Sometimes Minato-sensei would babysit me since my dad was a friend of his. He was cut off by Obito. Wait, so he got mad because I said something bad about his friend? He asked. Kakashi frowned. I don't think so, but that may have been a small part of it. Please wait until I finish though, he requested and started speaking again. Then one night, really late, an ANBU came by and delivered a message to my father, telling him that he had a mission that he had to attend to, an S-ranked. Obito frowned. Kakashi's father had been killed on an S-ranked mission? As requested though, Obito didn't interrupt, despite really wanting to. The mission went south pretty quickly, and my father was left with two options: finish the mission and abandon his comrades, or save his comrades and fail the mission. He chose the second one, and when he returned to the village everyone started to shun him, even the ones he'd saved on the mission. It was very important to Konoha. Anyway, my father eventually locked us up in our house. His ninja skills started to deteriorate rapidly. He refused to train or answer summons from the Hokage. At the time, the council had started to put together a case to try my father for crimes against Konoha. The night that they were going to take him into custody, though, I returned home to find that he had acted before they could arrest him. Kakashi looked up and Obito could see the unshed tears in his eyes. And even though Kakashi would have mocked him for such a thing, Obito couldn't bring himself to make fun of his teammate for being upset by this. He'd killed himself. "That's why Sensei got so angry with you," he said. Obito could tell that there was more that he wanted to say, but it was cut off as Kakashi flinched back, putting his hand up to his temple with a hiss of pain. Kakashi's POV. He had wanted to reiterate that he didn't blame Obito for what he'd said, when his head began to throb painfully. "This blade has a long history, Kakashi. It belonged to your great-grandparents, and has been passed down, along with our traditions of upholding Konoha's will of fire." The voice of his father sounded in his mind. He opened his mouth to speak again and bit back a scream as the pain intensified. "Kakashi, come with me. There's something important that I must tell you before I run out of time." What the hell was going on? He felt a hand pull his away from his face, and was surprised to see concern in his teammate's features as Obito looked down at him. "He help, please," he bit out through clenched teeth. He felt the hand pull away and he sunk back against the tree, panting harshly as more pain crashed down on him. "Don't interrupt me, Kakashi." He felt the ghost of a strike on his left cheek. He hoped Obito was quick to find someone, provided he was actually looking for help rather than just leaving him there. After what felt like hours, he was lifted from the ground. He fought weakly in protest. "I've got you, Kakashi." Even though he had difficulty, he could make out his sensei's voice and refocused his attention back on the pain and flashes of his dream. Thankfully, even though he could hear his sensei's alarmed voice telling him to stay awake, he felt the darkness beckoning and welcomed the relief from pain as he lost consciousness.